Hey guys, this is Star What If. How are you all? Please support to subscribe this channel for watching new interesting stories. So in this video, we will see second part what if Harry redefined his wisdom legacy to change Wizarding World. Here is short summary. Harry takes on a new identity, Alec, revealing a hidden intelligence and legacy that challenges the perceptions of Severus, Albus, and the Wizarding World. As he redefines his place in magical history, relationships are tested, and the future of Wizarding society is forever altered. But before we start, if you want more stuff like this, then be sure to subscribe and like this video. And if possible, share this video with your friends. Now let's start the story. When Severus finally finished with the potions, it was about 3 in the morning, and he finally felt he would be able to come to grips with the fact that Alec was none other than Harry Potter, the student he had hated for years. It had taken him a while to admit to himself that he had been unfair to the boy. He had always seen the father instead of the teen, blaming him for everything that went wrong and twisting his actions so they would fit the image he had of James. A part of him also pointed out that Harry had never allowed himself to act like he was doing now. He knew that the child had been putting a front to everyone to the point in which everyone saw the golden boy and not Harry himself. That fact made him feel a bit better. He had been just as misled as everyone else, in a bad way, but in the end, it came back to the same. Sighing, and still in a pensive mood, the dark-haired potions master returned to his room, only to find the Ravenclaw prefect asleep over the book he had been reading. For an instant, he considered the idea of waking the boy up and chastising him for sleeping while he was supposed to look after Alec, but after a moment he dismissed that idea. After all, it had become much later than he had expected, and the teen must have been tired after the last few days. Silently, he levitated the Ravenclaw to the living room and lowered him to the couch. After throwing a light blanket over the teen, Severus went back to his room, and after a slight hesitation, he lay down next to Alec. It was unlikely that the teen would wake up before him, and Snape didn't really want to sleep on a couch. The next day passed slowly. After dismissing the Ravenclaw prefect, Severus had taken one of his books to the bedroom and continued to watch over the sleeping teen while reading. At noon, Minerva came over. She looked much better than the night before, and it was obvious that the other teachers had indeed left her to rest. She sat down next to him and told him of her visit to the hospital that morning. It seemed that while Albus was doing much better, he had not awakened yet, which was starting to worry his doctors once again. The two professors chatted for a while before the Gryffindor head of house ushered Severus out of his own rooms so he could take a break from watching Alec. After getting over his surprise of being tossed out of his own rooms, the potions master decided to go check on his own students. Entering the Slytherin common room, he was surprised to see most of them sitting in the middle of the large room, clustering around something he couldn't see. As the older man approached the large group of students, he could clearly hear a voice rising over the shocked whispers of the teenagers. "I never really hated Muggle-borns, and those of you who have been told repeatedly that you are better than them just because of your blood should know better by now. After all, in this school there are many Muggle-borns, and you can't tell me that some of them aren't better than you. If you want a perfect example of a powerful Muggle-born, you only need to look at Rowena Ravenclaw. She was born to two perfectly non-magical people, and yet she could best nearly anyone in a duel." A 7th-year student, who had been listening intently, interrupted his rant. "But if you think so, then why does everyone say you hated Muggle-borns?" The ghost, who was floating comfortably over a couch, locked eyes with the girl. "There are several reasons. Godric was the one who started the rumors about me disliking Muggle-borns, even though he knew I was in a relationship with Rowena." A boy raised an eyebrow. "They were just rumors that originated because of jealousy." Salazar looked a bit embarrassed. "Well, not completely. You have to understand that at the time the Muggles knew about us, and like anything that they don't understand, they wanted to destroy us. Muggle-borns are just as powerful as pure-bloods, but their attendance to this school opened the doors for attacks by Muggles. At one time, they managed to kill 70 students before a teacher could intervene. I'm sure that you can understand that that was a very large shock to all of us. Most of those students had been 1st and 2nd years, and they had been under our protection and with nearly no means to defend themselves. Under those conditions, I indeed said that I wished that there were no Muggle-borns in our school. Of course, Rowena very quickly took me to task, but the damage was done, and Godric started to spread the rumors. A younger student frowned up at him. But then, what about you-know-who? He wants to kill all Muggles and Muggle-borns. Salazar's gaze moved to the young boy. And let me assure you that if I was alive right now, I would kill the bastard with my own hands. I can't believe people consider following him and his maniacal ideas. A fourth-year girl shrugged a bit helplessly. We are Slytherins, that's what we're expected to do. The ghost scowled at her. Don't speak nonsense. What does Slytherin have to do with anything? Without giving them a chance to answer, Salazar continued. No, don't tell me. I guess you're talking about all those fairy tales about how every Slytherin student had turned dark while the Gryffindors are the symbols of light, right? Honestly, how the wizarding community continues to exist while ruling themselves by such crap is beyond me. Or have they forgotten how 400 years ago, Dark Lord Gwendian nearly took over, killing more than half the wizarding community? And he sure as hell was not a Slytherin. Seeing their uncomprehending faces, the ghost finally turned to Severus, acknowledging him for the first time. Severus, just who on earth teaches history of magic around here? This should be fourth-year material or something like that. All students turned around sharply, only now noticing their head of house standing behind them. Most looked uncomfortable, knowing he was a Death Eater. Ignoring them for the moment, Severus nodded to the ghost of the dead founder. Binns does. He's a ghost, completely obsessed with goblins and their rebellions. But I'm afraid that even if he bothered to teach wizarding history, none of the students would learn anything anyway since they sleep during his lessons. Salazar looked pensive for a moment before floating a bit higher. I'm going to have a chat with him, this is ridiculous. Before he disappeared through the door, Severus spoke again, smirk firmly planted on his lips. Do us all a favor and go right to the part in which you drive him away. It would be good to have a competent teacher for once. The ghost returned his smirk. I like how you think. I'll see what I can do to convince him to take some extended holidays. Extended as in forever, Salazar laughed. Of course. And then he disappeared, leaving Severus behind to deal with his shocked students. The silence that followed the ghost's departure was finally broken by a sixth-year girl. She stood up from where she had been sitting and looked up at him intently. Professor, you're a Death Eater, right? There were several gasps, coming mostly from the younger students, but the professor merely raised an eyebrow, waiting to see what the question was about. Tell us what it's like to be a Death Eater. Tell us the truth. My parents have always told me that being a Death Eater was the greatest honor you could ever achieve, because that way the purebloods would rule the world and make sure that our power remained as strong as it is now. They said that if Muggle-borns were allowed to continue living with us we would lose all of our power in the end. But how can that be right when Voldemort, who they say is the most powerful wizard of our time, is really a half-blood? Before he had the chance to answer, Severus was interrupted by another of his students. My parents always said that they were honoring Slytherins by following his heir. But now Salazar's ghost says he's disgusted with the Dark Lord, that he loathes him and everything he's doing. Please, Professor, we need to know. We no longer have the truths our parents gave us, and I think it's time that we decided what to do based on facts, not on our parents' dreams. Severus was faced with a large problem. If he gave in and told his little snakes the truth, he would surely be foregoing his position as a spy. There was no chance that Voldemort wouldn't hear about this. And yet, here was his chance at not only redeeming himself for the crimes he had committed all those years ago, but also to save his students and turn the House of Slytherin to what it was always supposed to be. He would be able to save most of these children from the same horrible mistake he had committed in his youth. In the end, it was not difficult to decide. Settling down in an empty chair, he summoned his pensive. If he was going to do this, he was going to tell them everything and trying to shock as many of them out of the little world of power and promises their parents had built for them. Very well, I'm going to show you what it's like to be a Death Eaters. Anyone who doesn't wish to see, leave. When no one moved, Severus nodded. Very well, if halfway through you feel you can no longer watch, you're also free to retire to your rooms. Once his little speech was done, he started to draw memories and put them in his pensive. Once he was finished, he started to speak, slowly detailing every horrible thing that being a Death Eater implied. He knew that it would be too much for some of them, especially the younger ones, but if he could take them out of Voldemort's influence, he would be able to deal with the repercussions. After all, seeing was not the same as doing, and he would save his snakes from doing those gruesome deeds. Only a quarter of the students were left when he finally finished. Most were looking slightly ill and were looking at him with disgust and fear. How could you? I can't believe. While his job was done, the students had been most surely turned away from Voldemort after all that. Severus realized that he was about to lose their trust and he didn't want that. He needed them to know that they could come to him if they needed to. Reluctantly, he drew a few more memories. Those were some of the many times he had reported to Albus and had been able to save some lives doing so. When that round of memories was finished, the disgust in the children's faces had changed to awe and respect. You were a spy, Snape smirked lightly. Well, not anymore. I have no doubt that this will reach the Dark Lord's ears soon enough, and right now I can't take my chances, I'm needed here. And that realization warmed him more than helping his students had. Alec needed him, as did Albus and Minerva, and not because he had been a spy. Standing up, he nodded to the students that were still in the common room. He had the sudden urge to return to his room and watch over Alec. Please, go make sure your classmates are all right. I'll ask Madame Pomfrey to give you sleeping potions if you need them, you only need to go and ask. If you wish to speak about what you saw, feel free to come to either Professor McGonagall or me. The professor knows nearly as much as I do about what goes on in the Death Eater meeting and maybe you'll feel more comfortable talking to her. Nodding at them, he left the common room and went back to his quarters, hoping he had done the right thing. After entering his chambers, Severus only stopped long enough to warn Poppy about his Slytherins before abruptly entering his room. Minerva looked up surprised at his sudden entrance, but he paid her no heed. He had been sure he was doing the right thing a while ago, but now doubts had started to surface. Ignoring the questioning gaze that was following his every move, Severus threw his outer robe to the floor and sank into the free chair that had been placed next to the bed where Alec was still sleeping peacefully. Minerva closed the book she had been reading and looked at her colleague intently. She could see he was troubled but didn't understand what could have happened to put him in this state. What happened, Severus? Is there anything wrong? The man snapped his head up and looked at her as if he was noticing her presence for the first time. Wrong? No. Well, maybe. I didn't think it was wrong, but now I'm not sure. Shaking her head, the woman looked at him in amusement. Have you been taking lessons from Albus? You certainly are making as much sense as he usually does. That remark made Severus chuckle and calm down slightly. He knew he needed to tell her, but he was half afraid she would consider what he had done a horrible mistake. Finally, he took in a deep breath and quietly explained everything that had happened that evening, adding only his previous meeting with Salazar. The only thing he didn't mention was the truth about Alec. He didn't think Minerva would mind much about the boy being Harry, but he had made a promise, and he intended to keep it for as long as he could. When he finished his story, he sat back in his chair and finally looked up at the woman sitting on the other side of the bed. He was rather surprised when he saw a very pleased smile on her face instead of the condemning look he had been expecting. That's such wonderful news, Severus. To think that you may have managed to save all those children from such a horrible mistake. While pleased by her words, he had to tell her of the consequences of his actions. It didn't seem to have dawned on her yet. Firstly, we don't know if that will be enough. After all, it's going against everything they have been taught since they were babies. And second, you realize I may have blown up my cover right. This will reach Voldemort's ears, one way or another, and then there will be hell to pay. The woman moved so suddenly that Severus barely saw her. In an instant she was standing in front of him, hands firmly on his shoulders and leaning down to look him in the eyes. If you think, for one single second, that you're going back to that monster, you better forget it before I make you. You did what you had to and there are no maybes in this, Severus. Voldemort will find out and will know that you were a traitor. If you go to him, you will be killed, and that wouldn't do any of us any good. We need you here. You're one of the only ones around here able to keep a cool head when things go wrong. There's no way in hell we can do this without you. Snape calmly put a hand on one of hers, squeezing it reassuringly. Her words had warmed him in a way few things had before, and while he knew she was exaggerating a bit, it felt very nice. "Thank you, Minerva, and don't worry, I wasn't planning on going." The witch gave a satisfied nod and backed away. "Good, I'll leave you with Alec now. I need to make an appearance in the Great Hall and see how everything is going. And we still need to deal with the students of the Fifth House. Most of them will be ready to be released from the hospital wing tomorrow." Severus nodded. "Is there anything you need me to do?" The woman shook her head lightly. "No, don't worry, the other teachers will probably deal with most of it." The potions master nodded, and after reminding her that the Slytherin students may come to her to talk, he showed her out. When he returned to the bedroom, there was a tray full of food waiting for him, and taking the obvious hint, he sat down and ate his dinner. The evening passed quietly. He read and marked papers on a desk he had placed next to the bed. He was about to finish with the fourth-year papers when a sound coming from the bed attracted his attention. Looking towards it, he saw that the teen was starting to show signs of waking. Silently, he stood up and moved to sit next to the boy, who, at the same time, opened his sleepy eyes. "Uncle Severus." His voice was slightly hoarse, and Snape let him sip on a summoned cup filled with water. Once he was done, Alec lay back down and looked around him curiously. "Where are we?" Severus gently caressed his cheek. "We're in my rooms. Do you remember what happened?" The boy frowned for a minute, before his eyes flew wide open and he tried to sit up on the bed. A gentle hand prevented him from completing the movement and firmly pushed him back into the pillows. "Don't even think about it, you're in no shape to be running around yet." Harry blinked up at the man. "But what about Granddad? Is he?" He didn't dare finish the question, afraid he would receive bad news from the man. Seeing his anxiousness, Severus gently caressed his cheek. "He's fine, or as fine as possible right now. Whatever it was you did saved his life, and it looks like he's going to make it." Feeling very relieved at the man's words, Harry started to relax and his eyes dropped again. He was about to fall back asleep, when Severus shook him gently. "Alec, try to stay awake for a bit. I want Madame Pomfrey to take a look at you, and you need to eat something." The boy grumbled lightly under his breath, but he made an effort to push sleep out of his mind. When he was more or less sure that the teen would remain awake, Severus left the room for a moment to summon the nurse and ask some food from a house elf. 10 minutes later, he was back next to Harry's bedside. The boy was staring at the ceiling intently, as if it was the most interesting thing that existed. The poor child looked like he was about to lose his battle against sleep, but luckily that was when the nurse arrived. Poppy immediately set out to examine him, talking all the time to keep him awake. Once she was done, she turned to Severus, who had been waiting with the soup the house elves had brought. "Give him that and then put him to bed. I'll be waiting in your office so we can talk." Snape just nodded and went to sit on the bed next to the half-sleeping child. Grabbing the boy so that he was now leaning against his shoulder, he gently fed him. They were halfway through when Alec finally wasn't able to remain awake, and between 2 bites of soup he drifted off. Chuckling lightly, Severus arranged him comfortably on the bed and went to join the nurse. He was slightly surprised to not find the woman alone. Minerva was sitting in one of his comfortable seats and both witches were drinking tea. Poppy looked up and smiled at him when he silently closed the door behind him. "Is he asleep?" Severus nodded and sat down, taking a fresh cup of tea. He was out like a light before he even finished his soup. Minerva shook her head, clearly amused even if she was worried. "How is he doing, Poppy?" The nurse looked pensive for a moment before answering. "Quite well considering what he did. I talked to the staff at St. Mungo's. While they don't know exactly what he did, they were able to give me a quite accurate account of the things he healed. It's impressive. A few of the Metawizards think he might be a natural healer, but I don't think so." At Minerva's raised eyebrow, she elaborated. "Firstly, they are very rare. There hasn't been one for the last 100 years, and even if I can't completely sure, he doesn't really show the signs. Natural healers don't only heal others, they also heal themselves, and Alec doesn't seem to do that. Besides, I can't believe that his parents wouldn't notice, or at least Albus. Such a thing is very noticeable, especially as a child, and with Alec's power, I doubt he would ever have been hurt or playing, and that is the kind of things wizards are taught to notice when they get children. Personally, Poppy thought that the last reasoning was fairly stupid. It wasn't like those horrible muggles would have noticed anything. But the many times that young Potter had been in her infirmary were enough to convince her that Harry might be many things, but a natural healer was not one of them. For his part, Severus was thinking much along the same line. With the many visits that Alec had done to the hospital wing, there was no way he could be a healer. If he isn't a healer, then what happened, Poppy? The woman looked pensive for a moment before answering. I may be mistaken, since I wasn't there to begin with. But some of the doctors agree with me, and it certainly is more probable than the natural healer theory. Seeing the impatient looks, she sighed quietly. I think it might have been an extreme case of wish magic. Minerva nearly jumped out of her seat. That's impossible, Poppy. Only very young children have wish magic, and at most they are able to summon a toy, certainly not heal the injuries Albus had. Poppy nodded in agreement. I know that, but to start with, Alec is much more powerful than a normal child, especially a little child. I scanned him during the summer, and while most of his power is still untapped, I wouldn't be surprised if he became as powerful as Albus when he grows. Secondly, a child will only wish for a toy because that is what he really wants. There have been cases in which a child has been able to apparate away from extreme danger or to stop something unpleasant to happen to his parents. There are not many of those cases, but it has happened before. While Minerva still looked skeptical, to Severus that made perfect sense. Of course, it probably made more sense if you knew that Alec was Harry, and if he were to believe the rumors, Harry had done things like that practically his whole childhood. He still was amused of the tale he had heard about the boy's aunt a few years ago. Looking at Poppy, he wondered for the first time if the nurse was aware of the truth. It would make sense for her to be one of the only ones able to spot the deception. After all, while Albus could change the outer appearance of Harry, he hardly was going to change the boy's inside or his magical core, and the nurse would be familiar with both after the years. Shaking his head lightly, he turned to his Gryffindor colleague and decided to help Poppy out. I think she might have a point. Remember about the wards? Even Albus couldn't explain it, and it would fit perfectly in Poppy's wish magic theory. This seemed to be enough to convince the Gryffindor head of house. Nodding, she turned her attention back to Poppy. Okay, we know what probably happened, but what about Alec? Does he need special care? How long will it take for him to get back to normal? The nurse shrugged lightly. I would say to just leave him have a few days rest, and then he'll be able to join the students again. Turning to Severus, she added, he doesn't need to be in bed all the time, he can get up if he feels like it, just make sure there's someone around him in case he has a relapse. Snape nodded lightly, and after the three of them talked for a while longer, the two women left him alone. After checking that Alec was still peacefully asleep, Severus went to the living room, leaving the bedroom's door ajar, and settled down to read until it was time to sleep. The next few days passed peacefully. Severus spent nearly all his time with Alec, making sure the boy wouldn't overwork himself. While the boy had wanted to visit his grandfather nearly from the moment he woke, both Severus and Poppy agreed that it wouldn't do him any good right now. While the old man wasn't getting worse, he hadn't woken up either, and it was starting to really frustrate his doctors. That morning, Severus had allowed Alec to go up to the Great Hall for lunch with him. Even though the potions master had insisted he sat with the teachers at their table, Harry couldn't have been more relieved. He had hated being cooped up in the professor's rooms, and no amount of pleading had got him out of them. He suspected he had even managed to make Severus cross at him more than once, which had caused him to back off. The last thing he needed was the older man mad at him. Halfway through lunch, Alec was wishing he was back to the potions master's rooms. The students hadn't stopped looking to him since he first sat down between his aunt and uncle, and it was finally starting to get on his nerves. He was about to ask his uncle if they could leave, seeing that the man had finished, when a lone raven appeared through the window the owls usually used at breakfast. All the teachers frowned lightly. They had all spotted the dark envelope that the bird carried and were wondering what it might be about. The raven didn't go to anyone, instead it flew to the door that led out of the Great Hall and landed in front of it. As soon as the bird touched the floor, dark smoke started to come out of the envelope. Most teachers stood up, wands in hand, ready to handle whatever it was that the mysterious raven had brought. Alec also stood up, and while he didn't have a wand, his hand was starting to glow faintly in preparation for what might come. The smoke rose over their heads, and a face appeared in it. It was a horrible face. Bright, cruel red eyes peered at them all from a snake-like face. Snape hissed under his breath, "This couldn't be good." Alec, who was standing at his side, tensed, his face going blank as his power flared a bit more around him. Before anyone had the chance to say a word, the horrible figure spoke. "That was ridiculously easy. Be happy I have no interests in entering the school right now, or you would be defenseless." The students slowly started to understand just who was talking to them, and scared whimpers could be heard across the large rooms. All teachers were frozen in place, watching attentively for the monster to try to do something, but Voldemort seemed content to just talk. "It really is pathetic that the supposedly most defended school in the whole country loses all its power when one man is missing." His horrible face twisted into a cruel grin. "And speaking about Dumbledore, I really hope he is enjoying his new quarters. Not that he'll be able to enjoy them for much longer, really. I'm sure he's eager to go ahead and face his next adventure, as he put it. And don't worry, I'm planning to help him along." Realization started to dawn in the teachers' faces, and most of them started to tremble. The thought of the headmaster, injured and defenseless in the hands of that monster, was terrifying. Obviously not minding their terrified looks, the Dark Lord continued with his speech. "Of course, I'm willing to negotiate. After all, as much of a danger as the old man was, there is one other that I want more." His face became as hard as stone and the red eyes glittered madly. "Give me Potter. I do not believe for a moment that none of you know where he is. I want him within 2 days. If he hasn't stepped out of the wards before the second day has gone by, I will kill the old man in the cruelest way possible." He seemed to think for a bit and then grinned madly. "Or maybe I will force him to witness as this school is destroyed and all his precious children killed. We'll see. It doesn't matter right now. Knowing Potter, he will be in my hands before the 2 days have passed." Snape's mind was working furiously, trying to put away his shock and find a solution to the terrible situation they found themselves in. He was trying to think of a way to track Voldemort down when a movement at his side distracted him. Alec had turned around and was about to step away from them. Knowing what the child was about to do, Snape quickly gripped his shoulders, turned him around, and pressed him against his side. Furious blue eyes glared up at him, and he just stared down at him sternly. "And just where do you think you're going, young man?" His voice was a mere whisper, but it carried the annoyance, concern, and fear that the older wizard felt. "Let go, I need to get out." Snape's face was a mask. "Oh, no you don't. You're not going anywhere." Harry tugged at the hands that were holding him. "You don't understand." Snape, seeing that the boy was about to get loose and not wanting to draw more attention to them, picked the child up and forced him to lay against his chest. In an even softer whisper than he had used so that only the child would hear, the potions master said, "I understand perfectly all right, Mr. Potter." Severus felt the child freeze in his arms. Looking down, he was met with scared blue eyes. "You know." There didn't come sound out of the boy's mouth, but Severus was able to read his lips just fine. Maybe he shouldn't have told Alec that he knew this way, but at least he could concentrate back to what Voldemort was saying. When he lifted his gaze, his eyes met Voldemort's and he couldn't suppress a shudder. The man seemed to notice this and his grin grew even more horrible. "I'm almost wishing that the Potter boy doesn't show up. It would give me great pleasure if Dumbledore saw his grandson tortured in front of his eyes." Severus stepped back a bit, drawing Alec closer to him. The child was trembling, but he didn't know if it was because of Voldemort's words or because of the revelation that he knew his secret. As the smoke still coming from the envelope grew lighter, Voldemort turned his gaze to one of the tables. "Come to me, my children. Hogwarts is about to fall. There's nothing more you can get from it. A few of my loyal ones are waiting outside for you to take you where you belong. It is time for you to take your place at my side and to learn everything you still need to know." Almost before the Dark Lord was finished with his little speech, Draco Malfoy had jumped out of his chair and was sauntering to the doors, a smirk proudly drawn on his face. Behind him, his two stupid gorillas were walking, probably not understanding what was going on. Severus' heart nearly broke as one after another of his Slytherins started to stand and follow the blonde. When the last Slytherin had made it out of the door, the smoke cleared completely, leaving only the corpse of a raven behind. Severus, with Alec still in his arms, collapsed in his chair. He had failed. He had tried to draw his children to the light and he had failed. As the students and teachers around him started to move and show their distress, Severus could only think about the little children that had been under his care. Merlin knew what kind of life awaited them now. Bitterly, he amended that thought. Voldemort had Dumbledore under his power, and now all the hope they had rested on the shoulders of the child that was trembling against him. Trying to put his mind to better use, he turned his attention to Alec. The child had closed his eyes and was gripping his robes tightly. Alec, blue eyes looked up at him. The sadness in them nearly overwhelmed him. "Professor, I'm sorry, I shouldn't have, but I mean the headmaster," he said. Severus gently put a finger against his thin, pale lips. "Not now, my child. This is neither the place nor the moment to talk about it. And it's Uncle Severus, remember." Alec blinked in surprise. You're not angry." Severus raised an eyebrow. "Let me assure you I'm way more angry with you for trying to sneak away than for posing as the headmaster's grandson." Before Harry had the chance to answer, Minerva approached them. The other teachers were trying to calm and organize the remaining students but weren't having much luck so far. "Severus, I've sent Professor Sinistra to the hospital to check on Albus, but I don't have much hope." The younger man nodded in agreement. "Who was supposed to be there?" Minerva sighed. "Remus and Pomona were there. I hope they're all right. Phileas has gone to warn the Aurors. I expect some of them here soon." Turning to the boy still cradled in the potion's master arms, she bent down a bit. "Alec, are you all right?" The boy shook his head and buried his face in Severus' shoulder. The older man sighed. "Maybe I should take him to the dungeons and give him a sleeping potion. This is not good for him." Minerva, who had been watching the two men carefully, noticed the pained expression that crossed the Slytherin head of House's face when he talked about the dungeons. She knew that he was thinking about his students. Placing a hand on his shoulder, she squeezed it gently, trying to comfort her younger colleague. "It's not your fault, Severus. You did everything you could to help those children. It was wistful thinking that you could." Whatever it was that she wanted to say, she didn't get the chance. The doors to the great hall banged open and a few bodies were thrown to the floor. Both Severus and Minerva watched entranced as the white mask fell from one of the Death Eaters lying out cold on the ground. Slowly, both teachers looked up and were faced with a large group of Slytherins that were looking back at them smugly. A seventh-year Slytherin smirked at their surprised expressions. When he spoke, it was clear that he was only talking to Severus. "Oi, Professor, you didn't honestly think we were going to join that crazy half-blood, did you?" Another girl nodded besides him. "Yeah, we're Slytherins, not idiot, we have our pride, and we bow to no one." A third student, younger than the former two, took over. "Besides, Hogwarts is our home just as much as it is to other students. None of us want it destroyed." A small girl looked up at Severus, bright eyes smiling up at him. "And we couldn't betray you like this. You are the father we never had. You take care of us. What would we do without you?" All the other Slytherins, even the oldest, were nodding in agreement. There was a tense silence for a moment and then two students of Ravenclaw stood up and started to clap. Slowly they were joined by other students, and even the Gryffindors stood up to join the ovation. Severus, overwhelmed by the words his little snakes had uttered in front of everyone, buried his face in Alec's shoulder. The small boy, understanding that his uncle needed some comfort, quickly hugged the man tightly. And while he could feel wet tears soaking his shoulder, Harry was sure that there was a real, proud smile on the potions master's usually stern face. As all the teachers joined the students in applauding the Slytherins, Minerva placed a hand on Severus' shoulder. "Well done, my friend, well done. Hogwarts is won again." The prefects and some of the professors took the students to their common rooms. They thought it would be better to have them out of their way when the Aurors arrived. The Death Eaters and the few students that had really intended to join Voldemort were still lying unconscious on the floor of the Great Hall, waiting for them to be questioned. Severus, after talking shortly with Minerva, stood up with Alec still firmly tucked against him and followed his Slytherins to the dungeons. Once they arrived at the portrait that led to the Slytherin common room, Severus nodded slightly to them. "Wait for me in the common room, I'll be right back." Once that was said, the man walked deeper into the dungeons to his own rooms. He wanted to talk to his Slytherins, but he somehow doubted they would be comfortable with him talking to them in front of Alec. Once he entered the large room, he put Alec down and looked at him intently. The boy was looking down at the floor, refusing to meet his eyes. Sighing, the professor bent down on one knee, forcing the student to look him in the eye. "Can I trust you to stay in here on your own and not to run away at the slightest chance?" While Severus admitted that Alec was a very good actor and could misdirect people at his heart's content, especially when he had Dumbledore's backing up, he was not such a good liar. Snape was used to look for direct lies, and the teen's eyes immediately revealed the boy's true feelings on the matter even as he was shaking his head yes. Sighing, the man shook his head. "I would appreciate it if you didn't lie to me like that." Feeling the boy wince, he sighed and stood up. "Come with me." Reluctantly, Alec followed his uncle down to his bedroom. Once there he was ordered to get into bed. A look to the man's stern face told him there was no chance of him getting out of it, so he silently complied with the man's wishes. When he was safely tucked in bed, Severus handed him a potion. At once he recognized the sleeping potion. Knowing his magic wouldn't be able to fight against the effects, Harry turned his head away. "I don't want it." Snape frowned down at him. "But you need it, and not only because I want to make sure you stay put. Madame Pomfrey told us you had to take it easy, and today certainly didn't match that description. So, open up, because I don't really want to force you but I will if I need to." Knowing that the man never made idle threats, Harry resigned himself and took the potion. He wanted to go out of the school, to save Dumbledore as the man had saved him. But he knew that with Snape watching him as he did, he wouldn't have the chance. Severus stayed at the child's side for a long moment, making sure he was truly asleep. After that, he summoned a house elf and told him to make sure that the boy didn't leave the room should he awake. Once that was taken care of, he headed to the Slytherin common room. After entering the room he remained at the door, waiting for them all to notice him while looking carefully over them. Once most of them had noticed his presence, he spoke. "Firstly, is anyone injured?" A few students groaned lightly, causing him to narrow his eyes. Finally one of the 7th years answered him. "Nothing serious, Professor. Just a few bumps and bruises and 1 or 2 cuts. We took them by surprise, and they didn't have much of a chance to fight back." Snape nodded. "Madame Pomfrey is going to be down here in a bit. I want everyone that was hurt to let her treat you, understood?" More groans came from the students, but they nodded in agreement. The potions master's eyes softened as he looked over them. "I don't think I have ever been prouder of my little snakes as I am today. You have brought our house honor and glory, something that was long needed. By doing what you did, you've proved that you are just as much a member of the Hogwarts family as any of the other students, and with your selfless actions, you have brought Hogwarts together once more." While most students looked embarrassed, a 5th year snorted softly. "Yeah, right, selfless my ass. We just didn't want to join the Nutter." Severus chuckled along with most of the students. "Ah, well, there's no need to let the rest of the school know about that, now is there?" More chuckles. A 4th year looked at him. "What's going to happen now, Professor? What will be done about Professor Dumbledore? Is Potter going to come back?" Severus shook his head. "I don't know. I'm sure that by now the Aurors are questioning the Death Eaters, and maybe they know where Professor Dumbledore is being held. After that, I don't know what we'll decide to do." A 1st year approached him timidly. "Do you think the Dark Lord is going to hurt the headmaster because of us?" Severus frowned and gently ruffled her hair. "I don't know, but do you really think that Professor Dumbledore would prefer you to join Voldemort to being hurt by him? I have known the professor for many years, and don't doubt for an instant that he would sacrifice his life for one single student. So, don't feel guilty for doing the right thing." The students were nodding, most of the younger ones looking relieved, when Poppy entered the room. After nodding to Severus, she immediately took charge of the large number of students who looked resigned at being poked and prodded. Severus, smiling slightly as all his charges were led to their rooms so that Poppy could look over them comfortably, left the room to go back to his own quarters. Once he had made sure that Alec was still deeply asleep and would remain so for a few hours, the potions master made his way back to the Great Hall. There were already a few Aurors in there and it seemed they had just finished questioning one of the Death Eaters under Veritaserum. Seeing him approach, Minerva motioned him to her side. When Severus reached her side, he motioned towards the unconscious men. "Have they said anything useful?" The deputy headmistress looked thoughtful. "They don't know where Voldemort's base is, but they had portkeys to bring the children there." She motioned over to a table where several Aurors were bending over, looking at something. "They're trying to track down where they led to. If they don't manage that, we may have to take them directly." Severus frowned. "Voldemort might have guessed what has happened by now. If we use the portkeys, we'll most likely land in a trap." Minerva pursed her lips. "I know, but what else can we do? No one knows where Harry is, and even if we knew, there would be no way we could put him in that kind of danger." The potions master frowned. Should he tell her the truth? He agreed with her that they wouldn't use Harry, but the boy had other ideas and he could hardly keep him drugged for the next 2 days. Minerva might be able to help him to keep the child here. Sighing, Severus rubbed his eyes. "I know where he is." The Gryffindor teacher looked up at him sharply. She took his arm in a firm grip and drew him to a corner so that no one would overhear. "What did you say?" Severus looked down at her calmly. "I said that I know where Harry is." Narrowing her eyes, the woman demanded. "Did Albus know? Who else knows?" The man sighed. "Of course Albus knew. And as far as I can guess, only Amanda, Chris and maybe Poppy know." Looking at her intently, he added. "Albus didn't tell me, if that's what you're wondering. He doesn't even know that I know." Minerva narrowed her eyes, but in a way she felt reassured that the old man hadn't confided in either of them. It would have hurt if Severus had been told but not her. Dismissing those jealous thoughts, she turned to the matter on hand. "Where is he then? Is he safe?" Snape snorted lightly. "Right now I have him drugged, sleeping in my bed. He wanted to leave, the little fool." Slowly, realization started to dawn in her eyes, and Severus, noticing this, nodded in encouragement. "Alec." Smiling slightly, the man shook his head. "Amazing, isn't it? The two of them have been playing us for months and neither of us suspected anything." Seeing the woman frown, he quietly added. "Don't be too upset, Minerva, they did it to protect the child, and you have to admit no one could have done a better job of it had they tried." Sighing, the witch nodded. "I know." Looking up at him, she raised an eyebrow. "I'm surprised you can still get along with the child after finding out such a thing." Severus grimaced. "The one who told me forced me to get over my hate for James and look at Harry as he is. I realized that Alec is probably the closest thing to Harry that I have ever known." She was spared an answer when Serena entered the large room. Ignoring the Aurors, she immediately headed to where they were standing. Minerva nodded at her in greeting. "How are Remus and Pomona doing?" The woman sighed sadly. "They were both quite badly injured, but the staff at St. Mungo's assured me they will be fine in a few weeks. It seems they put up quite a fight, but the Death Eaters that took Albus managed to put up wards to keep others away so help didn't arrive in time. We're lucky that Albus' niece and her husband weren't there at the time." Severus nodded in agreement. "Have they been informed?" Sinistra nodded. "Yes, I went to tell them. They should be warning the rest of the family right now." Her two companions nodded, but instead of talking again, they watched as an Auror approached them. Kingsley smiled tiredly. "We think we've been able to locate the place where the portkeys are directed at. We need to act quickly before Voldemort had the chance to move away." Looking at them, he added. "Will you be coming with us? We haven't had the chance to gather many people, so all help would be appreciated. But it's going to be dangerous." Snape scoffed at the thought. "Of course we're coming, or at least some of us are. Try to stop us." The Auror chuckled lightly. He had always appreciated the man's sarcastic words. They were a wonderful way to calm him down. "I'll go and get the others ready. We'll be going in an hour." As Kingsley turned around, A ghost popped in existence next to them, startling them quite a bit. Severus blinked in surprise. Salazar, don't do that. The ghost merely raised an eyebrow. I merely wanted to warn you that the young one is starting to show signs of waking. Cursing softly under his breath, the potion's master turned around, ready to go back to his rooms. A soft voice stopped him dead in his tracks. Severus. When the younger man turned to face the ghost, Slytherin spoke. I know he's very young and that you want to protect him, but it would be good for you if you took him with you. He raised a transparent hand to halt the protests. Look, I don't know if you realize, but Alec is extremely powerful and knows very well how to use that power. I myself have been training him even though there was quite little I could teach him by the time I met him. If you want to win this war, you will have to allow him to do his part. Without him, you don't stand much of a chance. Then he smirked lightly. Besides, unless you tie him down somewhere, there's no way that you'll keep him here, and it would be better for him to go with some backup, wouldn't it? Without another word, the ghost disappeared. Snape sighed softly and once again turned to go, only this time he was stopped by a female voice. Do you think he's right, Severus? The younger man turned lightly so he could watch the Gryffindor head of house. I hate to admit it, Minerva, but he probably is. Alec is powerful, and no matter how many of us go face the Dark Lord, we can't match his power. The only opportunity would be to sneak in and out, but it's unlikely that we succeed, especially since he will be waiting for us. Not giving them a chance to comment, Severus finally left the room. When Severus entered his bedroom, he saw Alec sitting up in bed and engaged in a silent glaring contest with the house elf he had left to take care of him. The boy looked up when he heard the door, his glare immediately died when he saw who was standing there, and his gaze moved down to the covers that were still lying over his legs. Snape approached the bed and, after dismissing the house elf, sat down in the chair that had taken permanent residence besides the bed. I thought I had made it clear that you weren't going to put yourself in danger, didn't I? Alec nodded reluctantly. But Granddad, would have killed the lot of us if we had allowed you to leave, and you know that as good as we do. Harry knew that he was right. He knew that Dumbledore would have grounded him just for trying to do something as foolish to get out so that Voldemort could get his hands on him. But the problem was that Dumbledore wasn't there to ground him. He was trapped by an insane maniac and who knew if he were still alive. It was taking everything he had to not just curse Snape and leave. Seemingly reading his mind, Severus quickly started to speak. We have found a way to get to Voldemort, one that doesn't involve you being captured. Against our best judgment, we have been advised to take you along. But if you decide to come, you will have to promise me a few things first. Harry looked up at him warily. He trusted the man without a doubt, but he refused to stand back and watch as the others fought. Of course, he admitted that there were very few things that could hold him back and that going with the others would be much safer, so he settled down to listen to what the man had to say. Seeing the quiet acceptance, Severus started to list his demands. Firstly and most important, you will always remain at my side. I don't care what happens, I want you to stay close to me. Should something happen to me, you will go search for the nearest Auror or professor and stay with them. No running around on your own. Harry was frowning. You don't honestly expect me to leave you alone if you're injured. The older man looked down at him sternly. This isn't about me, I want you to be safe. So, yes, if I was to be injured, I want you to leave me be and look for someone else. I don't want you to be left on your own in the midst of Death Eaters. And the last rule, I will give you a portkey. Should you be injured, I want you to portkey back immediately. Is that clear? Alec was about to shake his head. He certainly didn't agree with the second rule. But one look at the man's face told him clearly that he either agreed or that he would be staying behind. He hoped that the man would be all right, because he really didn't want to break his promise to him as he knew he would not leave the man alone. Sighing, the boy nodded quietly. Severus frowned down at him. Promise me, Harry. The boy finally looked up at him. I promise. About half an hour later, a large group was formed in the Great Hall. They were mostly Aurors, who had continued to ignore Fudge's orders to not intervene in Hogwarts matters because they thought it was the perfect chance to get rid of as many Death Eaters as possible and had come to help out. The teachers were standing a bit separated from the main group. A few seventh years had insisted on going with them, and while they could force the youngest to remain behind, those of them that were of age could do as they wished, despite their professor's disagreement. The youngest of the group, by far, was Alec. Severus had told him that he should go as the headmaster's grandson, this way the Death Eaters wouldn't pay so much attention to him. Resigned, Alec allowed the older man to put a dark cloak around him and then turned his attention to the proceedings. It had been decided that the first group would use a portkey, and once they arrived, they would send out a magical surge that would allow the rest of the wizards to apparate to where they were. This would have to happen very quickly since they were expecting a welcoming committee to be there to greet them upon arrival. The small group that would be using the portkeys led the way outside. They needed to be all out of the wards so they would not waste time to get to Voldemort's lair. Harry walked silently between Severus and Minerva. The two adults had agreed to keep the teen close to them, neither wanted him there, but now that Minerva knew the truth, she agreed that it might be the chance they had been waiting for. Just before they all passed under the wards, Alec stopped short, a pensive look over his face as he narrowed his eyes. His hand shot out and clutched Severus, who stopped to see what was wrong. Alec. The boy tilted his head slightly. They have put something over the wards. As soon as I cross them, Voldemort will know I have left the castle. The potions master frowned darkly. He hadn't thought of that, and they certainly didn't need to warn Voldemort that they were on their way. Minerva shot them a questioning look and walked back the few paces that brought them to their side. What's wrong? Sighing, her colleague explained their worries, and the three of them stood quietly, contemplating what they could do about it. Severus was about to suggest that they better leave Alec behind, when a ghost appeared in front of them. At first, the Slytherin thought it was Salazar, but soon he recognized the Ravenclaw ghost. The transparent woman paid the two adults no heed and instead focused her attention to their young companion. I have a message from the lady to you, young Ravenclaw. Harry nodded and waited patiently for her to elaborate. Some of the others were now looking at the trio, wondering why they weren't moving. Unperturbed by all this, the ghost continued. She tells you to remember your lessons with her. Your abilities to shield your mind can be applied to your magic. You should be able to mask your presence easily since you usually already do it subconsciously. Those words surprised the boy. I do. What does she mean by that? The ghost's shimmering eyes looked at him intently. Young one, you have an enormous power, you know that, you've been training to control it for months. But not many people can sense it. Ask anyone around here how strong you really are, and they will probably consider you a rather common wizard. Since you were a child you have masked most of your power, now you only need to extend that mask a bit more so that it covers you completely. Alec looked a bit lost. What the ghost said made sense, but he wasn't sure he would be able to pull it off. He hadn't even managed to completely shield his mind, how was he supposed to extend the same concept to his magic? He was about to question the ghost again when a warm hand came to rest on his shoulder. Looking up, he came face to face with his former head of house. Alec, while I don't know much about shielding a mind, I learned a long time ago how to shield my magic. It was an old trick Dumbledore used to teach those of us involved in the war against Grindelwald, since he wanted to destroy the most powerful wizards so they couldn't fight against him. Squeezing the thin shoulder gently, she closed her eyes. Close your eyes, child, I'll show you what you need to do. Reassured that someone was guiding him now, the boy complied with her orders and followed her lead. He soon found himself in what he had come to recognize as his mind. The room was exactly like he remembered it, peaceful and beautiful. The only thing that was different was the small tabby cat sitting next to the glowing orb. Recognizing his professor, he raised an eyebrow, waiting for her to tell him what he should do. To his surprise, she jumped down from the table and moved to a side of the room. There was a large painting there, and unlike the peaceful atmosphere that surrounded them, it was showing a rather violent thunderstorm. Frowning, he reached out and was about to touch it when a soft voice touched his mind. Careful, child. Behind this painting rests all your power, and it is through the images of this painting that it comes out of this chamber for you to use. What you need to do is try to change the feeling of it. Your power represents thunder, try to calm it, and try to mold the picture so it shows something else. But be careful, Should you change it too much from its true nature, you might lock it in, and that would be very bad. For a few long moments, Harry contemplated the picture. He needed to change it. The only question was, what should he transform it into? Suddenly, inspiration struck. Putting both hands on the painting, he concentrated very hard on the image he had seen in one of Salazar's books. Ever so slowly, the picture of the thunderstorm started to change. In its wake, a body was formed. Minerva looked curiously, trying to not make any noise that could break the boy's concentration. She could barely contain a gasp of surprise when she saw a large dragon moving under the boy's hands. She recognized it from the few times Hagrid had talked of them to her. There were myths that said that a really strange breed of dragons lived in thunderstorms. They traveled with them and fed themselves from the electricity formed in there. The images Hagrid had showed her were mostly guesses to what they might look like, but Minerva was sure that that was what Harry had been aiming for when he started. When the wings were finally formed, the child opened his eyes and looked satisfied at the large dragon. It had started to move around, thunder still crackling around him. Turning around, the boy looked intently to his professor. "Do you think that will be enough?" The tabby rubbed her head lightly against his legs, and the gentle voice once again ran through his mind. "I'm sure it will be more than enough, Harry." The boy frowned and lowered his eyes. "Uncle Sev told you." The cat looked up at him and nodded. "He had to. It was too dangerous for him to keep this from me. But don't worry, no one else knows yet." Smirking slightly, or at least Harry thought that was a smirk on the cat's face, the woman continued. "And what did Severus tell you would happen if you ever called him Uncle Sev?" The child chuckled lightly. "I think that he would make me clean cauldrons no matter what I called him if it started with Uncle." The cat frowned lightly. "You can't seriously think that, Harry. Everyone can see that the man cares deeply about you. He has known for several days, and in those days he has continued to keep care of you. Do you really think that he would have done that had he been angry with you?" Harry shrugged lightly. He knew she was right about Severus taking care of him. But if there was one thing Harry had learned from the man, that was that he had a deep feeling of responsibility, and that once he had promised Dumbledore that he would take care of him, the man wouldn't back out. The gentle voice pulled him out of his morose thoughts. "Now is not the time to start doubting him, Harry. He cares enough to keep you safe and comfort you when you need it. Everything else you'll have to work out with him when all this mess is over." The tabby cocked her head as if listening for something and then spoke again. "Come on, let's get out of here. I'm sure Severus is growing impatient." With those words, the room started to fade and Harry opened his eyes. He was immediately pulled in a warm embrace. "Are you all right?" Smiling slightly up at the man holding him, the teen nodded. "I'm fine, everything went all right." Looking at the Gryffindor head of house, the man nodded and then turned to where the others had finished their preparations. "Come on, they are waiting for us." The first group left as soon as everyone was standing outside the wards. Severus was standing just behind Alec, with a hand clasped firmly on his shoulder. The boy could have told him he was able to apparate on his own, but he decided against it since it was doubtful that he would have been allowed to go on his own anyway. Not even a minute had passed when Harry felt the magical signal. Frowning a bit, he tugged at Severus' hand. "Why aren't we moving?" The man blinked down at him. "We're waiting for the signal, Alec." Before the boy was able to reply, some of the wizards started to feel the magical wave and followed it. Sighing down at the boy, understanding that Harry had felt the magic earlier than them, the professor simply shook his head and apparated them away. They appeared in the middle of a vicious duel. There were nearly 200 Death Eaters, and they were all casting Unforgivables, not giving their enemies a chance to survive if they were touched. Harry felt Severus start to curse everyone in sight, but while he remained at his side as promised, he didn't pay attention to the fight. Instead, his eyes quickly flew around the room, trying to find either Dumbledore or Voldemort. He finally found both of them. The Dark Lord was sitting in a large, throne-like chair, looking over the fight with a small, amused smile. The hatred Alec felt for the man became even more intense when he saw his grandfather, shackled to the wall with chains, clearly still unconscious from whatever it was that had been done to him. He had been so intent on the frail figure of his headmaster that he didn't notice the Death Eater approaching him from the side. Severus' cry of warning was the only thing that saved him from certain death. In an instant, Harry had turned around to face his opponent, and not even thinking about wands, he sent the man flying away from him. The soft thud he heard was enough to tell him that the man wouldn't stand up for a while, so he centered his attention back to the other black-robed men. Several Death Eaters had obviously thought he would be an easy target, as it was obvious that he was very young, but he quickly disabused them of that notion by sending several of them flying around and cursing the rest into submission. Unluckily, his actions drew the attention from the man sitting on the throne. Harry had just dealt with another Death Eater when his eyes, still hidden under the cloak, suddenly locked with the blood-red eyes of his longtime enemy. The fight around him continued, but the team didn't care anymore. There he was, the one who had hurt his family, his real one and his pretended one. The one man who had taken more from him than any other ever had. His hatred grew even more, and not caring about rules anymore, he started to advance towards him. Severus was too occupied with trying to keep himself alive to look at his charge, so Harry had no trouble to walk to the other side of the room. So now and then, the boy had to get rid of a Death Eater that tried to keep him from getting to his goal, but they were usually brushed aside rather forcefully and without a second thought. Voldemort stood up. His eyes were shining with a mix of amusement, cruelty, and curiosity. He couldn't help but wonder who the boy was. When he was nearly in front of the Dark Lord, Harry shrugged of his cloak. It would only get in his way. Voldemort narrowed his eyes when he saw a child standing in front of him. He hadn't expected one so young to wield such power. Looking him over carefully, the snake-like man realized he was probably face to face with the old man's grandson. Smirking cruelly, the man ignored the fighting going on around him and spoke in those sibilant words. "Well, my boy, I never would have thought we'd have the chance to meet, especially not so soon." Harry calmly raised an eyebrow. He had been in front of the man before, and for once, he felt none of the fear he would have expected to feel. "You have my grandfather, where else would you expect me to be?" The Dark Lord threw his head back and laughed. "You're a brave little fool, my boy. Don't tell me you're here to save the old man." Looking at the man tied to the wall next to him, he smirked. "Even in the event that you manage to save him, which of course is not going to happen, there's not much of a chance for him to survive." Harry clenched his fists, rage starting to fill him. Suddenly a cold hand landed on his shoulder from behind and a soft whisper brushed his ears. "Calm down, Alec, he's only trying to get you angry so you will act without thinking." Knowing that Salazar was right, the boy unclenched his fists and tried to relax. Looking up at the man sitting in the throne-like chair, he saw that his red-like eyes were wide open, probably staring at his companion. The ghost moved from behind him and went to stand at his side. "So you're the one who has destroyed the Slytherin house, the one that I worked so hard to build." Voldemort's face changed from surprise to rage. He stood up sharply and pointed his wand at the two companions. "I have not destroyed the Slytherin house. I will bring it to greatness." Salazar sneered up at him. "Which greatness? To grovel at your feet like beeps? To kill muggles only to make themselves feel powerful? To install fear in the wizarding world so that you don't need to fight them? If this is your kind of greatness, you don't deserve to be my heir, you don't even deserve to be a wizard." Voldemort sharply shook his head. "You have no longer a say in these matters. You are dead, you have no longer the power to make those kinds of decisions." Salazar smirked. "Really?" Suddenly a soft light started to shine in front of him. Ever so slowly the light took shape and started to solidify. Harry looked at the ring floating in front of the dead founder. It was beautiful. It was made by two silver snakes that were biting each other's tails. The snakes' eyes were bright emeralds that were shining in power. The founder's voice rose over the sounds of the battle that was being fought behind them. In the ancient times, when an heir was found to be unfit for the position, there were ways to take their gifts away and give them to someone who was worthy. The ghost smirked at Voldemort's horrified face. "I may be a ghost, but you have declared yourself my heir, and therefore I have the right to deem you unfit for that position. I could choose someone to replace you, but you are right. I am no longer part of this world. I might choose someone that wouldn't be able to uphold my ideals in the world that you live in." He motioned to the ring still floating in front of him. "I will let this choose. In it I've put those things I consider important to be my heir, and the Slytherin ring will choose who will be my heir." Before Voldemort had the chance to reply, Salazar closed his hand over the ring and started to chant softly in Parseltongue. The ring started to shine even brighter and suddenly it blinked out of existence. Harry looked questioningly at the ghost, wondering what was going to happen. He was about to ask when Voldemort dropped on his knees and screamed. Another scream joined the sudden silence. Harry whirled around just in time to see Severus collapse. Ignoring the corpse that now laid in front of the throne, the boy ran in his uncle's direction. Uncle Severus. Most of the Death Eaters that had still been fighting had also collapsed and were now gripping their arms in agony. Harry ignored them all and fell down on the floor next to the man. He wasn't very surprised to see the silver ring shining proudly on the man's right hand. What worried him was that the man didn't seem able to stop screaming. Salazar appeared next to him and was looking down at him in concern. "Did you find out how to remove the mark, Alec?" The boy's head snapped up, suddenly understanding what was going on. Damn Voldemort, he had obviously decided that if he wasn't going to make it, none of his followers would either. Passing his tongue over his suddenly dry lips, he nodded hesitantly. "Yes, but it's not ready to be tested. I could kill him." Salazar looked seriously. "He's going to die anyway. Try it, Alec." Taking in a deep breath, he quickly moved his hand so it was clasped over the dark mark. Closing his eyes, he fell into a slight trance. He started to see the magic that surrounded them, and he focused on the dark strands that led away from the man. Grasping those strands in his mind, he started to sever them one by one, tying them to the man's own magic. After a few moments, he started to chant in Parseltongue. "You swore obedience to one, now it's time to get the reins back. That the darkness leaves you with filling light and that the skull changes to something of your own." Over and over he repeated those words till they were more of a plea than a charm. Salazar, who had been watching intently, saw how the shape of the dark mark disappeared from under the boy's fingers. Finally, with a last pull, Harry slumped forward, breathing heavily on his knees. As he removed his hand, they both saw that a big, black panther had replaced the ugly dark mark. After a few more minutes, Severus stopped screaming and lay panting next to them. Alec gathered the older man's head on his lap and started to brush his hair gently. While no one around them seemed to understand what was going on, the Aurors and Order members were quickly making sure that no Death Eaters would escape. Minerva silently knelt next to them. "Alec, are you all right?" The boy nodded, not moving his gaze from his uncle. "I'm fine, and I think Uncle Sev is going to be okay too." Suddenly remembering, he quickly moved his gaze to where his grandfather and Voldemort had been. "Granddad." Minerva gently squeezed his shoulder. "Don't worry, we're going to take him to St. Mungo's at once. Someone will come and help you and Severus, okay?" Before he had a chance to answer, the ghost who had remained silent till now, spoke up. "Don't worry, young Gryffindor. Severus and Alec will be fine, they just need to rest. I'll watch over them till someone comes to get them." Nodding sharply, the woman stood up and left them alone. Harry looked up at the ghost who was watching down at the half-unconscious man. "What happened, Salazar?" The ghost looked up and smiled slightly. "Well, as I said, the ring chose a new heir. Your Professor Snape seemed to be the ideal candidate, and as soon as he found him, he started to give him the bits of magic that defined Tom Riddle as my heir. I think you'll find that he can speak Parseltongue now. Anyway, the Dark Lord's body was held together by magic, but with those missing pieces, the magic started to become unsteady, and in the end, it was not able to keep its body together." The boy frowned. "But that would mean that Voldemort's soul is still out there, and as long as he's out there, he might be able to return." Even before he was finished, Salazar was already shaking his head. "The first time he died, Tom's soul only survived because his magic was intact. Without that power to support his soul and keep it here, he will just pass on as any other human who dies." Harry sighed in relief and turned his attention to the man lying next to him. "Uncle Sev." The man opened an eye and looked up at him. He seemed to be in a daze and didn't know exactly where they were. "Alec, are you okay? What's going on?" The man's voice was slurred and the boy could barely understand his words. Gently, he started to pet his hair. "Don't worry, Uncle, I'm fine, and so are you. Rest now, we're going back to Hogwarts." No sooner had he said that, 2 Aurors appeared at his side. The tallest one knelt next to him. "Are the 2 of you all right?" Looking at Severus, he smiled slightly when he saw him awake. "I don't know how you did it, but it's a wonder that you're alive. Every other Death Eater died as soon as Voldemort did." Severus raised his arm so he could properly see it, then, seeing the panther that had replaced the dark mark, he turned his head with a deep sigh and buried it in Alec's lap. "I'm free. After so many years, I'm free." After that he lost his grip on consciousness. The 2 Aurors, helped by a Medowitch that had just appeared from St. Mungo's, helped the 2 fighters back to Hogwarts. Once there, Madame Pomfrey took over. Most injured had been sent to St. Mungo's so she was free to fuss over them. Once Severus had been put to bed and looked over, the nurse turned to face Alec, who had till then been sitting on a chair in a corner. "Come here, Alec, to bed with you." The youth frowned at her. "I'm fine, I wasn't hurt." The woman raised an eyebrow, still pointing imperiously towards the bed. "You may not have any injuries, but you look exhausted. You shouldn't even have gone with them to that fight. You're way too young to do that and your magic wasn't ready." Knowing he wasn't going to win against the nurse in this, Harry allowed himself to be ushered to the bed and tucked in. He hadn't know how tired he really was, but halfway through the witch's work, he was deeply asleep. Harry woke up to the sound of people talking. His half-opened eyes immediately fell on the bed when he knew his uncle would be. To his relief, the man was awake and talking quietly to Poppy, who was once again examining his arm. Salazar was floating behind the nurse, a very smug look on his face. It was the ghost who first noticed he was awake. "Ah, look who's awake. Good evening, Alec." Both wizards turned around quickly at the ghost's words and looked at him intently. Harry looked from the nurse, who was moving towards his bed so she could check on him, to the man lying in bed. One look in those dark eyes and stern face and he knew he was in trouble. Not that he regretted what he had done, but he had broken his promise to the man, and he knew him enough to know that even if by doing so he had saved them, he would still be punished for disobeying him. Sighing, the boy leaned back against his pillows and allowed Poppy to check him over completely. When he finally felt the woman leave his side, he saw that Severus had left his own bed and was now standing next to him. Alec half expected him to start yelling at him right away, but to his surprise, the professor calmly sat next to him on the bed. "How are you feeling?" Alec shrugged lightly. "I'm fine, still a bit tired but I guess it'll go away with time." "How about you, sir? And Granddad? Your grandfather is recovering as well as expected." The unexpected trip to Voldemort's lair set him back a bit, but the doctors at St. Mungo's think he'll recover in a few weeks. As for myself, I'm fine too, still a bit shocked but that's to be expected. After all, I never would have thought I would one day be named the heir of Slytherin. Harry chuckled a bit, looking as the man played a bit with the ring that was now on his finger. "I think it was a good choice. You are after all the Slytherin head of house and have always worked to uphold its ideals." Severus shrugged slightly, clearly uncomfortable at the boy's words. Before Alec could comment further on the matter, the professor took his turn at speaking. "I think I owe you some thanks. If it weren't for you, Voldemort would have taken me with him." Harry shrugged. "It was no big deal, I wasn't even sure it would work. Besides, you saved me too. I don't know if I would have been able to kill him, no matter how much I've learned from Salazar and Granddad. It would have been a horrible fight." At those words, Severus started to frown again. Scowling, his voice became once again stern. "You shouldn't even have been near the Dark Lord. I told you to stay near me, or did you forget about your promise?" Harry lowered his gaze to the bed. He had been right to think that the man was quite annoyed with him. And yet, he couldn't even say that he was sorry because he wouldn't mean it and that would probably anger Severus even more. Pressing his lips together, Alec clenched his fists into the blanket that still covered him. "I didn't forget, but I did what I thought was needed, just as everyone else around me. Maybe I wouldn't have won in a duel against Voldemort, but I at least had a chance. You couldn't expect of me to just sit back and watch as that monster killed everyone." Those words didn't seem to appease the man at all. You lied to me. You were already planning to go after Voldemort even before we left the grounds. Harry shook his head lightly. I wasn't really planning it, but I knew I would go after him if I had the chance and everyone else was in danger. Severus' face darkened even more. Why did you make a promise you weren't planning on keeping? I did what was needed. Harry knew he was repeating himself, but he couldn't offer a better explanation. Besides, he was sure that his professor understood his need to help, even if he didn't want to admit it. After all, the man had done such things all his life. You wouldn't have let me come otherwise. The potion's master glared at him. You can bet I wouldn't have. If I had known, I would have had you dosed with my most powerful sleeping potion to make sure you stayed put and safe. After a short, tense silence, the man growled again. And to think I can't even punish you for this. Harry blinked, looking up at the man for the first time since the conversation had turned to this matter. Of course you can. Severus, still angry, passed a hand through his hair. This is hardly a school-related matter. Those words hurt, and Harry was forced to bow his head so the man wouldn't notice. It wasn't really that he wanted to be punished. Who in his right mind would like it? But he knew that he deserved it for betraying the man's trust, and the fact that the wizard didn't want to take action because it wasn't a school-related matter didn't sit well with him. He had treated Severus like an uncle for months, and while he had never had to discipline him through that time, he had never expected the man to back off when he had the right to do so. Did that mean that Severus no longer wanted him as his nephew? Maybe everything he had said about still liking him had been just lies to make sure he stayed safe until Voldemort was gone. Severus watched with a frown as Alec withdrew into himself. Even though he was still quite furious with the youth, he was aware that he had said something wrong, but tried as he might, with his mind torn between anger and relief at the boy, he wasn't able to come up with anything. Sighing, knowing that it wouldn't be a good idea to let this stew, he decided to ask straightforward what was wrong. Okay, out with it, Harry, what did I say to upset you so? His tone of voice, while still stern, was much calmer than it had been before, and it startled the boy out of his dark thoughts. Blinking up, he shook his head. It's nothing. Rubbish. I really am not in the mood to figure it out myself, Harry, so be kind enough to explain it to me. Alec bit his lip. He didn't want to explain, it would be embarrassing. But one look at the man's face told him that he wouldn't back off until he had an explanation. Sighing, he sat up and flexed his legs so he could rest his head on his knees. It's nothing. I just thought that even after Voldemort's death you would still want to be my uncle. Sorry for assuming such a thing. To say that Severus was shocked would have been an understatement. What on earth had brought this on? He had meant it when he had told the boy that nothing had changed between them, but something had made Harry doubt him. Thinking back at the conversation they had had, he immediately spotted the moment in which Harry could have had his doubts. Sighing softly, he passed a strong arm around the boy's shoulders. Harry, don't be silly, of course I still want to be your uncle. Nothing is going to make me stop. Harry looked torn between confusion and relief. But I disobeyed you and then you said you wanted to punish me but couldn't. If you want to be my uncle, then you can punish me. After a short moment, he continued in a softer voice. You once told me I should treat you the same way whether you were angry at me or happy. Snape shook his head lightly. He remembered that day. Sighing, he rubbed his eyes. One would think you want to be punished. Harry bit his lip. It's not that. He was about to try and explain when Severus drew him closer. Hush, I understand what you mean. I'll have to think on a suitable punishment, but I better do that when I'm not this angry at you. Alec shuddered a bit and nodded in agreement. He had gotten what he wanted, or at least what he told himself he wanted. Relaxing against the man that held him, he felt his eyes start to drop. He would have fallen asleep if a sudden thought hadn't entered his mind. Uncle, yes, who knows about who I really am? Severus looked down at the concerned, young face. As far as I know, only your supposed parents, Albus, Minerva, and I, maybe Poppy. Why? Harry shrugged lightly. I won't need to go around as Alec Dumbledore any longer, but I'm not sure how to tell everyone else. The potion's master shook his head. Leave things as they are for now. let's see what Albus has to say on the matter. Nodding, the child settled down with Severus' help and closed his eyes, ready to go to sleep. The Slytherin head of house had been sitting next to Alec's bed for nearly an hour when Minerva entered the large, white room. The woman headed immediately towards them. Severus. The man, startled out of his reading, looked up sharply at the soft voice. You're back early, Minerva. I thought the inquiry against the minister would take much longer. Frowning, he added, I hope things went well. The deputy headmistress nodded calmly. They went fine. Fudge wanted to make it a long trial, with dozens of witnesses and I don't know what more, but Madame Bones quickly cut to the case and proposed to use veritaserum on him. The Wizengamot immediately agreed. None of them seemed to have any doubts about the minister's actions, so it was really a quick thing. Severus seemed pleased at that. So he has been put out of office. Minerva nodded. Yes, due to incompetence and corruption. There are going to be elections in 2 months, and until then Madame Bones will be acting minister. They both remained silent for a long while, pondering what changes the future would bring. After a while, Minerva started to ask about Harry and how he was doing. Severus told her about the conversation they had had and asked for her advice on the matter. While they spoke, neither noticed the wide blue eyes that had moved from the tall, dark-haired man to the child sleeping peacefully on the bed. So, this was Harry Potter. He had been hiding under their very nose and no one had noticed. Silently, the stranger drew back, hoping that no one would notice her. This was great news and she had to think about what to do with it. 2 days later, Alec finally managed to convince Madame Pomfrey that he was all right and that he could leave the infirmary. Of course, the fact that he had managed to sneak out of the place 2 times already forced the nurse to just let him go. For a moment, the boy stood outside the door that led to the infirmary, wondering what he should do next. He really didn't feel like rejoining the young Ravenclaws. As much as he enjoyed Lan's company, he didn't want to lie to her anymore. The Gryffindors were also out of the question. Severus had been right in saying that they better wait to see what his grandfather had to say about it. Finally, knowing he couldn't just stay in the middle of the hall, the boy walked to his rooms in the headmaster's tower. It was strange to be up there without the old man. The tower felt colder. It wasn't really like home anymore. Sighing, Harry sat down in the living room, watching with blank eyes as a few students walked around the lake. Nearly 2 hours had passed when a voice startled him out of his musings. What on earth are you doing up here on your own? I've been looking for you everywhere. Harry turned around sharply. Uncle, sorry, I didn't hear you come in. Is there something wrong? The older man walked farther in the room and sat down next to the boy. I don't know, you tell me. Why are you sitting here alone? The teenager shrugged lightly and returned his gaze outside. I was just thinking. I didn't feel like returning to Ravenclaw and lying to them anymore. The man looked down at him, concern plainly written on his face. I'm afraid you'll have to hold the ruse up for a while longer, child. It really is safer that way until everything settles back. Harry nodded glumly. I know. They remained silent for a while, but then Alec remembered something the man had said. You said you were looking for me. The man nodded seriously. Yes. There are several things we need to talk about. Firstly, I thought you would be happy to hear that Fudge has been definitively kicked out of office. Madame Bones is going to come here someday next week to talk with us concerning our current standing with the ministry. The boy looked a bit confused. I'm glad to hear about Fudge, but why are you telling me about the new minister? Do I need to do something? Severus shook his head. No, I just want you to be careful while she is here. She won't come alone, and while I know that we can trust her, we don't know about her companions. Even if people don't know you're the boy who lived, being Dumbledore's grandson still makes you a valuable target, as I'm sure I've told you before. Harry cringed a bit when he remembered the day the man had told him the same thing. It had been over the summer, when, on his birthday, he had walked away from the adults to go look for some strange voices he had heard. He also remembered something else that the man had said that day. His uncle hadn't said anything about his punishment yet. Maybe it was time to talk about that. For a few moments he considered how to approach the subject, but the feeling of dread building in his stomach made him decide to just be blunt. Are you doing to spank me? Severus looked down at him with a frown before answering. That's another thing I wanted to talk to you about. If you were younger, I would seriously consider spanking you. After all, what you did was incredibly dangerous, and I would have used any means necessary to teach you that putting yourself in danger like that is by no means acceptable. As it is, I think you're a bit too old for that, and besides, I don't think it would help all that much. Looking at the boy, he muttered softly. Not that I think that anything is going to help to get that point across to you after everything that has happened. Harry winced slightly at the frustration he could hear in the man's voice. He was trying to come up with something to say, when the potions master continued, his voice becoming stern once more. Anyway, you're grounded for the next 2 weeks. You'll be staying with me at all times except for going to class and meals, which you'll take in the Great Hall. Besides that, you'll be taking lessons from either me or Salazar at least 2 days a week for the rest of the year. If you're going to rush out and put yourself in danger, at least you'll be as ready to face it as I can make you. Alec blinked, not sure about how he should be feeling at his punishment. He had actually been expecting it to be much harsher than that. The grounding was going to be boring, but at least it would keep him away from his fellow Ravenclaws, which he didn't mind that much. As for the lessons, it wasn't anything he hadn't been doing before, and he really didn't mind. Severus looked down at the pensive face of the child sitting next to him. It had been difficult to refrain his more preferred disciplining methods. If he hadn't had time to think about things, he would have had Harry scrubbing cauldrons for the rest of the school year. In the end, he had to take into account that the boy had saved him and that without him, they would probably be either dead or still fighting that madman. Finally, the potions master looked down at his watch and broke the silence. Come on, child, get dressed in some robes, we need to leave. Harry snapped out of his thoughts, a confused frown starting to show on his face. Where are we going? The older man smiled softly down at his charge. To St. Mungo's, of course. We thought you might want to see your grandfather now that he is finally awake. Harry's eyes widened in surprise. He's awake. Why on earth didn't you say so to start with? Jumping out of his seat, the boy grabbed his uncle's hand and tugged him out of his seat. Come on, Uncle Sev, what are we waiting for? The older man laughed softly, restraining the boy before he could drag him out of the door. We're waiting for you to put on a robe. As an afterthought, he added. And don't call me Sev. Harry barely listened as he threw a robe over his clothes and quickly dragged the man after him. They met up with Minerva, who was waiting for them down at Albus' office. She was smiling softly down at the teen when they entered the room. I was starting to think you wouldn't be coming. Harry rolled his eyes while he finished buttoning his robe. Uncle Severus was being long-winded once again. The older man ruffled Alec's hair. Watch it, brat, or we'll make it 3 weeks. The boy looked innocently up at his mentor. I don't think that will be necessary, uncle. The potions master didn't answer, but the amusement he was feeling shone clearly in his eyes. Minerva shook her head lightly and gave Severus the flow powder. Come on, let's get going. They arrived at the hospital without problems. Once there, one of the nurses immediately led them to the room Dumbledore had been staying in. Before going in, Minerva excused herself and went to check on Remus and Professor Sprout, who had been staying at the hospital being treated for the injuries they had sustained while trying to protect the old headmaster. Once she disappeared down the hall, Harry turned to look at the door and taking in a deep breath, he pushed it open. Knowing that the professor was following him, he entered the room. Amanda was the only one sitting there with the old man. They both looked up when they heard the door open. The woman quickly stood up and after gently keying her uncle, she left the room. Albus watched the two of them as Severus closed the door. After a silencing spell was placed around the room, Harry darted to the bed and into his grandfather's arms. Albus hugged the boy tightly against his chest, feeling the tremors coursing through the child. It's okay, Alec, everything is going to be all right. Severus went to sit in the seat Amanda had just left and watched with a fond smile as the two of them reassured each other. After a minute, he saw Albus wince a bit and immediately drew Harry away. Come here, Alec, I think your grandfather still needs to take things easy. The boy allowed himself to be seated in the man's lap and turned to watch the older man closely. How are you feeling, Granddad? Much better, my boy. I hear from Amanda that I have to thank you for still being here. The doctors are still baffled at what you did. Severus snorted and muttered under his breath. They are not the only ones. Albus smiled gently down to his dark-haired colleague. And I hear it is thanks to you that we don't have to fear about the Dark Lord taking over again. Not to mention that the Slytherins have been accepted again as a welcomed part of Hogwarts, something that hadn't happened since my youth. Tell me everything that happened, I want to hear it from your point of view. Severus had to fight down a blush, but started to explain everything. From time to time, Harry intervened, explaining some things that Severus hadn't known or had seen differently. When they finished, Albus stayed silent for some time. In the end, he turned to Severus. I'm very proud of you, my boy. Your handling of the Slytherins has been masterful. I'm glad you were able to influence them so much. Minerva told me that you weren't sure about your decision, but as I'm sure she told you, you did the right thing. Keeping the children safe has always been more important than spying. The younger man couldn't help his blush this time. Bowing his head, he nodded in acknowledgement. Thank you, Albus, that means a lot. Nodding, the man turned to his grandson. I'm also proud of you, my boy, for saving your uncle. Without you, I think we would have lost Severus. Then he adopted a stern air. What I don't like is that you disobeyed Severus. I think that you and I will have a long chat about how to follow rules that are put there for your own safety. Harry looked down and nodded lightly. Severus chuckled softly. Don't worry, Albus, I think I've already made sure he understands. Besides, he's grounded. The two men discussed the details of his punishment, making Harry feel uncomfortable while still cradled in his uncle's arms. While talking, Severus noticed that the older man was growing tired and knew that they would have to cut their visit short. Yet, there was something else they needed to talk about before they left. Albus. The old man looked up, tired eyes fighting to stay open. Yes. Is there something wrong? The younger man nodded lightly. What do we do about Alec? Do you want him to keep walking around as your grandson, or should he return to being Harry Potter? The old headmaster, who had been leaning tiredly against his pillows, immediately sat up at the words uttered by his younger colleague. His eyes became fixed on the pair seated next to him. What did you say? Harry glared up at his uncle. You shouldn't shock him like that. It can't be good for his health. The man didn't bother to look apologetic. It wasn't every day you had the chance to shock the old man. I think you know what I'm talking about, Albus. The old wizard leaned back against his pillows, his gaze never wavering from the dark-haired man. How did you find out? His look lowered to the child. Did you tell him? Alec quickly shook his head. No, Granddad, you know I wouldn't. Looking up at his mentor, he frowned. Actually, you never told me how you found out. Severus grimaced. Salazar told me. He was worried about the effect my reaction would have on you. He is very protective of you, child. Harry winced a bit. You took it better than I thought you would. The potions master shook his head lightly. It's good that you weren't there when I did find out. It wasn't pretty. The man looked down at the child, ashamed of the way he had behaved. Don't blame Salazar about this, Harry. He did the right thing. I would have hurt you had I found out any other way, and for one, I am glad I didn't get the chance. Before Harry had the chance to answer, Dumbledore intervened. I'm happy about that too. But what is this about Salazar? Who is he? When did he find out? And more importantly, how many people know? Between the two of them they tried to keep things short and tell the man the important things without entering in details. There would be time later to explain things more calmly. When they were finished, Albus was still frowning, trying to process everything that had been said. Finally, he passed a hand over his face and spoke. We'll have to talk more thorough about what's going to happen in the future. There are several things we need to take into account, one of them being Harry's guardianship. For now, I think it'll be best if you keep being Alec. I want to be there when everyone finds out and help you through it. Do you think you can keep it up, my child? Harry slid out of Severus' lap and went to embrace the older man. Don't worry, Granddad, it's going to be okay. Besides, I'm grounded, so I won't be able to spend much time with the other children. Both adults looked amused at the relief coming from the boy's voice. Severus looked at the pair teasingly. Maybe we should keep your punishment for later on. No. Both Albus and Severus couldn't help but burst out laughing at the horrified shout. When they finally calmed down, they saw that Harry was pouting, which nearly sent them into a fit of laughing again. Finally, Severus stood up and placed a hand on the boy's shoulder. Come on, Harry, we need to get going and let Albus rest. The teen reluctantly nodded, and after hugging the old man once more they left the room. Chris, who had been waiting outside, nodded at them when they passed in front of him and entered the room to keep watch over the old headmaster. After searching for Minerva, who was sitting with Pomona, and telling her that they were leaving, the pair went back to Hogwarts. Once there, Severus turned to the boy. Go get some of your things from the Ravenclaw common room. I expect you to be down in my rooms within an hour. Alec nodded, and after making sure he was presentable, he left the room. Once he entered the large room, he was immediately hugged by Lan. Alec, are you all right? Jason said you were ill. The boy gently pushed her away, aware that everyone was listening to them. I'm fine, don't worry about it. One of the 7th years looked directly over them. Any idea how the headmaster is doing? Glad that the attention had been diverted from him, the boy smiled brightly. He's doing fine, he finally woke up, and the doctors say he will be up and around in a few weeks. A generalized cheer rose through the room and everyone started to talk at once. Poking Lan in a side, he motioned towards the stairs and the two of them left the common room. Once there, the girl went to sit on a bed and watched as her friend started to put some of his things in a bag. Are you leaving, Alec? Looking up, he saw the frown that marred her face. Sighing, he put the bag down and went to sit with her. Not the school, but I'll be staying with Professor Snape for a few weeks. The girl looked at him, startled. How comes? Harry started to blush. How was he supposed to explain that? Yeah, well, you see, I'm kinda grounded. Lan blinked a few times before falling back against the pillows and laughing. You've been grounded by a professor. I didn't even think it was possible. What will your grandfather say? Harry groaned. He actually agreed with it. The girl laughed even harder at that, while her companion just rolled his eyes and waited patiently till her laughing fit passed. It's not that funny. Drying her tears, the witch shook her head. It is, Alec, it is. What did you do to deserve that? Sighing, the boy brushed his hair away from his face. I kind of disobeyed Uncle Sev in something I shouldn't have. Doesn't really matter anymore. I think I was doing what was right, and he probably believes the same, else I would have spent my evenings in detention for the rest of the year instead of just being grounded for 2 weeks. Lan rolled her eyes. Knowing Snape, you're probably right. If it was as important as you said, you got off lightly. So, you'll be staying with him. What about classes? Alec sighed. I'll still get classes with you and eat meals in the Great Hall. Lan nodded, and for a long while they kept silent. Finally, when Alec was about to pick up his bag again, the girl broke the silence. It's weird to know that Voldemort isn't around anymore. Startled at the sudden change of topic, Alec remained where he was. Lan looked up at him through half-lidded eyes. Were you there, Alec? Surprised, he glanced down at her. What makes you think that? Lan shrugged. It's just a feeling. We haven't been told much about what happened. Just that a group of Aurors and teachers went in there and battled the Death Eaters and managed to somehow kill Voldemort. The older students have been trying to find out what exactly happened, but they've only managed to know for sure which teachers were there. I know that Professor Snape went and he was injured. I haven't heard about you, but now you're saying that you're grounded for disobeying him. Did you follow them to the battle? Not meeting the curious gaze trained to him, Alec started to fiddle with his robe while considering what to tell her. Finally, he sighed and nodded slightly. I went with them, but not without them knowing. I wanted to go. My grandfather was in danger, and I needed to make sure he wouldn't be hurt anymore. Professor Snape allowed me to go under the promise that I would remain at his side. I didn't obey him. Lan nodded. No wonder he was pissed off at you then. That was very dangerous. Harry groaned. Not you too. My uncle and my grandfather have already told me how foolish I was. Lan smiled softly but let the matter go. So are you going to tell me what happened? I'm dying of curiosity about how Voldemort died. Was it Harry Potter? Harry looked at her sharply. No, it was not him. Briefly he told her about what Salazar had done and how Professor Snape had become the heir of Slytherin. Once he was done, he fell into silence while the girl tried to process everything she had been told. Finally, she laughed softly. Who would have thought it could be something as simple as that? Harry shrugged. At the time it hadn't felt simple at all, but he didn't need to tell her that. I wonder how Potter will feel about what happened. Alec looked at her questioningly. What do you mean? Lan shrugged. He was supposed to kill him, everyone knew that, and now suddenly someone else pops up and does his job. It must be weird. Harry looked down at his half-packed bag. I think he'll feel relieved that he doesn't have to kill that madman, that the duty that was put on his shoulders has finally been accomplished and that now he'll be able to lead a normal life. Nodding, the girl stayed silent for a moment, and then she stood up and headed to the door. You're probably right. It must have been hard to lead his life. I wonder if he will return now that everything is safe again. When she said that, her eyes locked with Alex and he couldn't help but wonder if she knew about him. They remained in a tense silence for a long while, their eyes never straying from each other's gaze. Finally, Alec lowered his eyes and smiled softly. When the time is right, I'm sure he will. Lan smiled too. I look forward to meeting him. Alec laughed a bit. I'm sure he looks forward to meet you too. The girl laughed a bit, her suspicions having been confirmed by a few words. I'll leave you to pack. You might need a few of your things to survive 2 weeks with Professor Snape. Harry laughed lightly as she left the room and turned to his things. Briefly he wondered how the girl had found out his secret, but decided to ask some other time. It wasn't really that important now. Lan may have many of the faults of the Creevy family, but she knew how to keep a secret. 3 days had passed since his confinement to Snape's chambers. Lessons had resumed that same day, and Harry was grateful for it. While his time locked up in his uncle's rooms wasn't as bad as it could have been, it wasn't much fun either. He had continually been reading, because at the slightest hint that he was bored, his uncle would usher him to the lab and make him spend hours cutting up the most disgusting ingredients. After the first time that had happened, Alec had made sure to always keep his head in a book. Not that he thought that his uncle didn't know that half of that time he was lost in thought instead of reading, but as long as he wasn't forced to work in the lab it was fine with him. The only bright spots in his forced seclusion had been the 2 visits he had done to his grandfather and the lesson he had had with Rowena about mind magic. So, after 2 days of that, he was more than happy to return to a normal school schedule, even if it was in first-year lessons. When he appeared at breakfast that morning, there were many questions about his continued absence of the Ravenclaw common room. It seemed that Professor Flitwick had only told the prefects that Alec would be staying with Professor Snape due to family problems. Harry had been grateful to stick to that story. There was no need to tell everyone that he had been grounded by one of his professors. Lan hadn't changed her behavior around him, for which he was grateful. There were times in which he even doubted if she knew the truth, but then one look in her bright eyes convinced him that she knew. The last class of the day was potions. Harry made sure to pay attention. There was no need to annoy his uncle more than he already seemed. Wondering what had his uncle in such a foul mood, Harry stayed behind after they were dismissed. Sensing his presence, Severus warded the doors and sank back in his chair. Is there something you wanted to ask, Alec? Else you should head back to our rooms. There is still some time till dinner and you could get started on your homework. The boy approached him. Are you all right, uncle? The man nodded tiredly. Everything is fine, Alec, you don't need to worry. Harry cocked his head. If everything is fine, then why are you in such a bad mood? Something must have happened. Severus looked up sharply, a glare evident in his dark eyes. I don't think I need to explain my actions to you, young man. Harry flinched at the sharp tone. It had been a while since it had been directed at him. No, uncle. The soft tone he had used didn't appease the older man. Trying to refrain his temper, lest he said something he might regret later, he sharply motioned towards the direction of their rooms. You're still grounded, Alec, go now. The boy nodded once and quickly left the room, deciding to give the man wide breath until he had calmed down. The evening passed in tense silence. Alec tried to read but couldn't concentrate on his book while the potions master corrected essays, seemingly oblivious to the uncomfortable silence. Finally, unable to take more of it, Alec quietly bid his goodnights and went to the room his uncle had given him, thinking that if things continued as today his time with the man was going to be even more miserable than he had expected. The man finally looked up when the boy quietly closed the door behind him. Sighing, he put his quill down and rubbed his tired eyes. He knew he owed the boy an apology. He hadn't deserved the sharp words, but he didn't know if he would be able to speak rationally yet, so he had preferred the strained silence. Today had been a bad day for all the professors. The Board of Governors had met and unanimously decided that Dumbledore was too old to continue in his position as headmaster. The last attack had severely harmed his health, and while he was expected to make it out without further problems, the board had decided that the strain of leading Hogwarts would be too much for him now, so, next year they would have a new headmaster. Minerva had been appointed as headmistress in functions until such a time in which Dumbledore, the heads of houses and the Board of Governors could meet and appoint the new headmaster. That, coupled with the fact that the new minister would be visiting them in a few days, was putting a strain on all the teachers, and while most of them were able to continue without signs of stress, he had had to revert to his former facade to keep it together. He was about to give up and go to bed when someone knocked on the door. Sighing, he went to greet his visitor and wasn't very surprised to see Minerva standing there. She had taken it upon herself to go tell Albus about the news, and while she hadn't said anything, he had half expected her to come down and talk to him when she returned. Silently, the two professors sat down and Severus served them a fresh cup of tea. Once they were settled, the potions master decided there was no sense in beating around the bush. How did he take it? The Gryffindor head of house looked pensively at her cup. To tell the truth, much better than I thought he would. I think he was expecting it. Severus nodded. While none of them had thought of the possibility of such a thing happening, he had no doubts that Dumbledore, as usually, had taken such a thing into account. I guess that's good. Minerva smiled lightly. You don't sound very convinced. Snape snorted. Don't take offense on it, Minerva. I'm sure that you will be appointed and that you will do a wonderful job of it, but he is Dumbledore. The woman laughed lightly. I know what you mean. I don't think anyone will be able to take his place. Severus looked with a slight smile towards the closed door where his charge was probably sleeping. Not yet, at least. Minerva nodded, knowing what her colleague was thinking. Also looking towards the door, she softly said, I think it also might have something to do with Harry. Severus raised an eyebrow. Oh, what makes you think that? McGonagall looked a bit reluctant to discuss it since she was only guessing, but in the end, she told him her thoughts. I don't know what the legal situation about Alec's guardians is, but I wouldn't be surprised if Albus tried to get guardianship over him. After all, the two of them really care about each other. I don't know if the ministry would be very willing to grant him guardianship of the boy if he remained headmaster of Hogwarts. After all, he would barely be able to spend time with the boy and there could exist problems with conflict of interests. Severus nodded. You might be right about that. It's about time that the old man has some time for himself and those he loves. The potions master remained silent for a while before speaking again. Have you thought what will happen to Harry if Albus doesn't apply or is denied custody? Minerva didn't move her gaze from the fireplace. I already have the papers to apply myself should it come to that. As in an afterthought, she added, I got copies of the papers for you if you want them. Not looking at her either, Snape nodded. Give them to me tomorrow. I also wish to be ready to fight for him if necessary. They both remained silent, sipping on their tea. After nearly an hour, the woman left and Severus retired to his rooms, leaving the mountain of essays where they were to be corrected tomorrow. Barely 3 hours after he had gone to sleep, Severus was woken up by sharp screams coming from somewhere in his rooms. Cursing, he put on a night robe and flew out of his room to the one placed just next to his. When he entered, he saw that Alec was trashing on his bed. He had kicked the blankets off and was shivering madly, crying out. Severus immediately went to sit next to the boy and drew him in his arms, trying to comfort him as good as possible. Hush, Harry, it's just a nightmare. You're fine, you're safe, no one is going to hurt you here. For long minutes, He continued to speak softly in the boy's ear and rubbed his back gently, trying to calm him down. Finally, Alec opened his eyes and latched onto him. Severus silently held the crying boy, trying to reassure him that he was not alone and that everything would be all right. Finally, after 10 minutes, Harry was able to get his bearings back and drew himself away from the concerned man. Drying his tears, he looked up apologetically. "I'm sorry for waking you. I should have put silencing charms around my room, but I haven't had a nightmare in so long that I forgot all about it." Severus narrowed his eyes. "I think your grandfather told you that you would be grounded for years if you did that again, and I quite agree with him on this. If I find out you have done such a foolish thing, you will be in a lot of trouble, young man." Harry flinched lightly at that. Having had this same argument enough times with Dumbledore, he knew that there was no reasoning with the man, so he didn't even try. "Yes, uncle." Not entirely convinced, the man quietly chanted a charm that would warn him about silencing charms put around the room. Not that he thought that Harry couldn't break it, but he would know if the boy did that. Alec, who had noticed, only rolled his eyes, having no intention of antagonizing the man for now. Settling back into his pillows, the boy curled up in a small ball. Severus watched this with a small smile and drew the blankets up to the boy's shoulders. "Will you have problems sleeping?" Harry shook his head. "I don't think so. It was just one of my regular nightmares. Today was just a stressing day." Severus nodded and gently brushed the boy's hair away from his face. "Okay. Go to sleep, I'll stay with you till you're asleep." Alec closed his eyes, comforted by the gentle touch. "You don't need to. I know, I want to. Now hush." With a small smile on his lips, the boy fell into a peaceful sleep, feeling safe under his mentor's vigilant gaze. The next morning, the news about the headmaster was announced. Severus had made sure that Harry knew about it before they went down to breakfast. The teen had been obviously upset, but his reassurances that Albus had taken it quite well had managed to calm him down. Alec wasn't convinced that this was the best choice, but after his uncle's words he decided to wait for a chance to talk to his grandfather about it before deciding on what to feel. After all, maybe Dumbledore was happy to leave Hogwarts and all the work it implied behind. Most students were quite upset by the news. It wasn't that they didn't like Minerva, but as Severus had said the night before, she was not Dumbledore. Most of the Ravenclaw turned to Harry after hearing the news. He was immediately asked about how his grandfather had taken the news. The teen could only shrug and say that he hadn't had the chance to talk to the man yet. He was sure he would have been bugged further if the bell for classes hadn't rung then. Lan was quick to drag him out of the hall and to the charms classroom, much to his obvious relief. When they went to lunch that afternoon, they were surprised to see that the teachers' table had become longer and that several ministry wizards were sitting there talking quietly with the teachers. Madame Bones was seated between Minerva and Severus and was quietly discussing something seemingly important with the two of them. Lunch went on peacefully. It was nearing the end, when Lan stood up. "I forgot my charms book in the common room. I'll see you there in a few minutes." Harry nodded at her and continued eating his dessert. No one had been paying attention to the girl until a piercing scream ran through the hall, silencing all conversations and making more than one person go for his wand. They all turned to look at the source of the scream and froze at the sight that met them. Professor Nerian stood there with an arm around Lan's neck and her wand pressed against the girl's throat. Her blue eyes were glaring around the room, daring anyone to move. The teachers, who had risen from their seats, froze when the Dada teacher's eyes fell on them. "Put your wands down, or the girl will die, and after her, all the other students until you manage to take me down." Knowing that that was no idle threat, they all complied and put their wands on the table in front of them. Rising from her position, McGonagall looked towards the other woman. "What is it you want?" Nerian's eyes became frozen icicles at the question. "I want Potter. My master wanted him dead, and I will make sure that that is what happens to him even if the Lord is no longer here to witness it." Several gasps rose from the students. They had never even suspected that the woman might have been a supporter of Voldemort. She had always seemed quite normal to them and for once had been a competent teacher. Minerva felt Severus tense at her side and narrowed her eyes. "We don't know where Potter is." Lan let out a small scream when the wand pressed more tightly against her throat. Don't lie to me. I know that he has been hiding under our nose. I heard you and Snape talk about it, so don't make me believe you don't know where he is when he is standing in this hall. The students and most teachers couldn't believe their ears. They had trouble believing her words. Surely she was insane. Potter couldn't be here without anyone knowing. Minerva went to answer her. Even if she knew that there was no sense in denying the truth, they needed time in hope that someone would hear what was happening. Before she had the chance, another voice interfered. Let her go. Nerian's eyes traveled to the voice and met the bright blue eyes of the boy standing at the Ravenclaw table. I already said I would let her go, but only in exchange for you, Potter. All eyes swirled around to his small form, but he didn't move a muscle. From the corner of his eyes he could see his aunt and uncle curse softly under their breath, but there really wasn't anything they could do about it. Very well, but how will I know you speak the truth? A nasty smirk covered her lips. You won't, but then again, if you don't come with me, she will die for sure. Sighing, the teen nodded and started to walk towards her, only to be stopped short by a blasting curse that landed just in front of his feet. Looking up, his gaze met her slightly crazed eyes. I don't think so, boy. Throw your wand away. I'm not so stupid as to let you near me with a wand on you. Alec was hard-pressed to not let a smirk bloom on his face, as if he needed a wand to take her out. Without a word, he did as she asked and threw the wand towards the teacher's table that was now behind him. Then he continued walking forward, and this time nothing slowed his advance. He was aware of the eyes of the student body that followed each one of his moves. They were probably wondering if he was really the Harry Potter. A quick glance to the fifth table showed him that Ron and Hermione seemed to be the most incredulous of the students. He would have to talk to them later on, but now he had something else to do. Turning towards their teacher, he saw that the woman had started to advance backwards, out of the great hall, dragging Lan with her. The girl had her eyes fixed on him, and he steadily returned her gaze. He knew that he needed to find an opening before they left the wards of Hogwarts, else they would be in quite a lot of trouble. The doors of the great hall slammed shut when he finally stepped outside, and he found that the woman's wand was suddenly pointed at him. The craziness in the woman's blue eyes had grown, and Harry suddenly realized that she wouldn't wait until they left Hogwarts to act. You die today, Potter. Before he could answer, Lan spoke. If you kill us here, the teachers will get you in a second and you will die with us. Nerian let out a sharp laugh. Do you think I mind, you silly girl? My master is dead, and without him, my life is meaningless. If I die here, after having killed Harry Potter, I will be remembered right along his name, and his remaining followers will worship my name until a new Dark Lord raises. Harry knew he needed to distract her, so he asked something he had been wondering about for a while. How comes you're not dead if you are one of his followers? You should have died just as every other Death Eater has. Nerian snorted. I don't know why you would want to know something like that if you're going to die, but to satisfy your curiosity, there were a few of us who had the Master's full trust and respect. We were the elite, and our marks are quite different from the others. We were tied to Voldemort only with our oaths, not with our magic, because we needed all of it to fulfill his wishes. He should have left you to us. We would have killed you without a problem. Harry smiled sweetly up at her. He had seen something that would be able to provide the distraction he needed. He just needed to wait for a few more seconds. It's a pity that he was such a nutcase, else he could have let you deal with small matters like me and concentrate on the important ones, like trying to teach you Death Eaters something worthwhile. After all his followers always seemed too incompetent to do much good. I guess that was his downfall. He hadn't really been expecting the cutting curse that tore through his shoulder and left him panting from the pain. He had rather expected a shouting rant coming from the woman. When he looked up, his good hand clutching his bleeding limp, he was met with ice blue eyes, who were burning in rage. You will regret those words, boy. I was planning on killing you quickly and getting it over with, but now I will enjoy making you scream in pain. Lan was looking at him with horrified eyes, but Harry knew nothing mattered anymore. Just at the moment when the witch was about to fire another cutting curse, sharp fangs sank in her ankle, making her howl in pain. Knowing that his chance was there, Harry quickly thrust his hand out and summoned his classmate, who went flying to him, torn out of unresisting arms. With a wince, he caught the girl against his chest, which sent a stab of pain shooting through his arm. Trying to ignore it, he fired another curse towards the woman, who was now kneeling down clutching her ankle with one hand while trying to find the snake that had bit her with the other one. The stunning curse reached its mark and the teacher crumbled to the ground without further sound. With a relieved sigh, Harry looked down at the girl that was now clutching his shirt in one hand while her eyes roamed through the unconscious woman. "Are you okay, Lan?" The girl turned to face him sharply. "Am I okay? Am I okay? Of course I am not. But you are the one bleeding here and you ask if I am okay." Harry looked faintly embarrassed. Yes, well, he tried to push some of his hair behind his ear before remembering that his hand was still coated with his own blood. Lan looked at his movements, concern replacing her former anger. "You're getting pale. I'll take you to Madame Pomfrey. She wasn't at lunch so I guess she'll be at the hospital wing." Harry shook his head. "Professor Nerian put wards around Great Hall. We need to break them down so they can get out." Alec turned to face the door and was already raising a hand towards it when his concentration was broken by the girl. She had grabbed his hand and was now dragging him away from the door. "Melanie." The girl's stride didn't change. "That can wait. They're not in danger and someone else will be able to handle it. It doesn't need to be you. Besides, I'm sure that the professors will be able to come up with something to break down the wards. They're not defenseless, you know." Harry would have bickered with her, but he was starting to grow dizzy from blood loss and knew that if he didn't get to the hospital wing soon, he would faint, which was the last thing he wanted right now. Poppy rushed towards them as soon as she saw them enter the hospital wing. She quickly took in Harry's pale face and blood-soaked shirt and gently pushed him towards a bed, where the teen collapsed and closed his eyes, trying to ward off the dizziness that had overcome him. He faintly heard Lan explaining what had happened to the agitated nurse as the woman's magic washed over him, healing his shoulder and leaving him sleepy. Something was pressed against his lips and he drank the sour-tasting liquid down before falling into a troubled sleep. Once she was sure that her patient was deeply asleep, the nurse turned around and started to push the girl to another bed, ignoring her complaints. She quickly had her tucked in and dosed with a sleeping potion. After the potion took effect, she called a house elf and told him to watch over the two children. Not wasting another moment, she ran out of the hospital wing into the Great Hall. She had to see if they needed help getting out. Poppy was quite reassured when she met large groups of students being led to their common rooms by prefects while the new minister and her entourage were flowing away and calling the orders. Quickly, she strode to the entrance hall and towards her fellow teachers. Flitwick was bending over the stunned Dada professor, his wand moving over her form and securing a binding charm over her. McGonagall and Snape stood to a side, quietly discussing something. They both seemed very agitated, so Poppy hurried to their side. The other woman was the first one to notice her. "Poppy, I need you to get the hospital wing ready. They have kidnapped Alec and Melanie Creevy." The other witch shook her head. "Actually they haven't. Those two are resting in the infirmary right now." Snape looked up sharply, fixing his dark eyes on the nurse. "They are with you." Poppy nodded, but before she had the chance to reply properly, he turned around and hurried towards the hospital wing, Minerva and Poppy trailing behind him. Before Snape could burst in, Poppy grabbed his arm and slowed him down. "Don't make so much noise, they're sleeping." Nodding, the Scytheran heir entered the white-colored room and immediately went to the bed in which his young charge was lying. Minerva took one look around the room and turned towards Poppy. "Did they tell you what happened?" The nurse shook her head lightly. "Alec was nearly unconscious when they got here and I needed all my attention to heal his shoulder, which will be fine in a few days. Melanie told me a bit about Nerian, but she looked about to have a nervous breakdown and I thought it better to put her to sleep." Nodding, the woman looked to where Severus was bending over Harry's still form, his hands gently prodding the boy, making sure he was doing all right. Once the potion's master drew back and sat down next to the bed, she walked up to him. "Severus." The wizard looked up, his lips pressed in a firm line and his face pale. "Yes. The Aurors should be here in a few minutes. Can you tell them what happened?" The man nodded, returning his gaze towards Alec. "Should I tell them about him?" Minerva followed his gaze and sighed. "There's no point in keeping it quiet anymore. All the students heard, so, even if we managed to convince the Aurors that that woman was just mad, the students will not be as easily convinced, you know how they are. Severus had to admit that she was right. The charade was up and it was now up to them to protect Harry from the incessant questions that it would bring. Severus was wrenched out of his thoughts when he felt Minerva leave his side. "Where are you going?" The woman turned slightly, a grim smile on her face. "Someone needs to tell Albus. He will kill us if he finds out any other way." With those words she left the hospital wing and quickly made her way to the nearest flow source. In a few minutes she was in St. Mungo and the witch quickly made her way to Albus' room. She was very surprised when she saw an old man sitting beside the former headmaster. They both looked up when she entered the room. Albus, who was lying propped up against some pillows, smiled when she entered. "Ah, Minerva, I wasn't expecting you so soon. I believe you haven't met my brother, Aberforth." "Brother, this is Minerva. She has replaced me as headmistress of Hogwarts and I'm sure she will do a marvelous job in her new position." The witch nodded to the old gentleman settled in the chair, ignoring Albus' words, but immediately returned her gaze to the lying wizard. "While it's a pleasure to finally meet your brother after so many years, Albus, I'm afraid I have bad news." Minerva quickly explained what had transpired at the school not an hour ago, carefully watching the former headmaster's face for any sign that her explanation would be too much for him. Once she fell silent, Dumbledore calmly pulled on a magical bell that was resting at his side, calling for the nurse to come to his room. The Gryffindor frowned at the man's actions. "Albus, are you feeling unwell?" The man didn't have the chance to answer because just then a young nurse entered the room, a smile firmly placed on her face. "Good evening, Mr. Dumbledore, is there something I could help you with?" Returning her smile, the old man nodded calmly. "I would like to talk with my healer as soon as possible, Miss Fairy." The nurse frowned in concern. "Aren't you feeling well, sir?" Dumbledore's calm expression didn't change, he just shook his head lightly. "No, I'm feeling perfectly fine, I just need to ask the good healer for a favor." After assuring them that the healer would be there in about half an hour, the nurse left the room, allowing Minerva to finally speak up. "What was that about, Albus?" The old man turned to face her, a stubborn expression firmly on his face. "I want to be transferred to Hogwarts Hospital Wing. I can't stay here a minute longer with everything that is happening there, and I need to make sure that Alec is doing all right." Minerva looked him directly in the eyes, trying to discern how much putting up an argument would help. Seeing the determination and stubbornness in the blue eyes, she immediately gave up. "The Board of Governors isn't going to be happy about that." Albus shrugged lightly. "They don't have as much power over us as they would like to think. Besides, they can't really kick me out until the end of term without reason if I don't wish it." Before Minerva had a chance to reply, Aberforth stood up. "I'll be coming with you, brother. I want to meet this young man you seem to have taken a liking to." Turning to Minerva, he nodded to her. "I'm going to pack a few of my things and I'll come back to help Albus. Maybe you should go warn your nurse about our impending arrival." Trying to squish her annoyance towards both men, she replied. "What makes you think that the healer will allow you to leave?" Both brothers looked at her as if she had asked a stupid question. "Minerva, my dear, what makes you think that the healer will have a say in the matter?" Severus had been sitting at Harry's bedside for nearly an hour after the Aurors had finally left. They had promised to try and keep things as quiet as possible, at least until Alec and Albus were feeling well enough to answer their questions. Severus had been forced to point out several times that they weren't looking for Harry anymore, so there was no need to know where he was, but the Aurors hadn't been appeased by his comments. He was still trying to think of some way to force the Aurors to leave the boy alone when a commotion drew both Madame Pomfrey's and his attention. After exchanging a quick look with the nurse, the dark-haired potions master stood up with a sigh. Growling softly, he strode towards the door and yanked it open. He wasn't very surprised to see a group of students standing there, obviously discussing if they should go in or not. They all fell silent as soon as they met his glare. "May I ask what that racket was about?" "This is an infirmary, not a Quidditch pitch, there are people resting in there." When no answer was forthcoming, the man scowled even more. "Someone answer me now, else I'll start taking points." Hermione, who had been standing at Ron's side, hesitantly stepped forward. "We heard that Alec was here, Professor." Snape's glare didn't diminish even though he was grumbling inside. They couldn't have waited till Minerva was back, they had to come and ask for explanations when he was on his own. "Yes, Alec is here, why?" The Weasley girl bit her lip. "Is it true, Professor? Is he really Harry?" Severus took in a deep breath. Why was he surprised to see them here? He should be grateful that only the small group of Gryffindors was here and not the whole house as he should have been expecting. Silently, he closed the door to the infirmary behind him, making sure the people inside wouldn't be bothered by their talking. "I believe the answer to that question is obvious, Miss Weasley," as Nereon shouted it in the middle of the Great Hall. The two girls sighed in relief, like a huge weight had been lifted from their shoulders. On the other hand, the Weasley boy started to grow red. "Why on earth didn't he tell us? We've been worried about him and all the while he has been playing with us." The potion master's cold eyes silenced his rant. "I think that both Mr. Potter and the headmaster thought that the boy's safety was more important than your feelings on the matter, Mr. Weasley. You knew very well who you made friends with in your first year, and if you can't accept that sometimes we need to do things we don't like to keep not only us, but also others safe, then it's time you either start to grow up or stop being friends with someone whose life will probably always be in some kind of danger." Ron, who had grown a bit pale, opened his mouth to make a retort, but luckily Hermione cut him short. "Can we see him, Professor? Is he all right?" The man turned his gaze to the girl. "He is sleeping now. He was hurt in the shoulder but nothing major. Madame Pomfrey assures us that he will be fine in a few days. Come back tomorrow and you will probably be allowed to see him." He was about to dismiss them when his gaze fell on the approaching figures. Albus. The children twirled around in time to see the headmaster approaching slowly, leaning on a cane and with McGonagall and another man hovering at each side. "Ah, Severus, children, it's good to see you again." The old man faltered a bit and his breath grew heavier. The potions master quickly rushed forward to support the man as Aberforth allowed the younger man to take his place. "What on earth are you doing here? You should still be in the hospital." Hermione and Ginny quickly opened the doors to the hospital wing as Minerva and Severus helped the man inside. "Now, Severus, I needed to be here. Besides, Poppy can take as much care of me as any of those doctors in St. Mungo's." The potions master went to reply but McGonagall shook her head. "Don't bother, I've already tried to reason with him but he is as bull-headed as always." Looking to the other old man walking behind her, she added, "They both are." Severus rolled his eyes. "Wonderful, there are two of them now." Together they stepped into the infirmary, and Poppy, who had been bending over Harry, rushed towards them. "Albus, what the hell are you doing here? In bed with you at once." The old man groaned. "Not you too, Poppy, is no one glad to see me?" "Don't get overdramatic with me, old man, you know damn well we are happy to see you, but not while you should be in bed." Ignoring the old man's pouting and his brother's laughter, the three professors put the old headmaster in the bed next to Harry's and tucked him in. Poppy immediately started to look the man over, making sure he was okay. Severus moved to the chair next to Alec's bed and sank down in it, leaving Minerva to deal with her Gryffindors. 10 minutes later, Albus had fallen asleep, Minerva had taken her students to the tower and Poppy had gone to her office to talk to the healers in St. Mungo's. Severus was a bit startled when Aberforth went to stand at his side. "So, this is Harry Potter." Severus nodded silently, wondering what the old man wanted. They stayed in silence for a few minutes before the man spoke again. "He is very powerful, have you been training him?" The potions master shook his head lightly. "As far as I know, Albus and a few ghosts have. I have taught him a few things but not much yet." The old man nodded. "Good, you shouldn't let so much talent go to waste. Have you considered apprenticing him to someone? It would probably be better for him, it would challenge him much more and it would force him to really work on his powers." Severus nodded slowly, he hadn't thought about it but it certainly made sense. "It would be a good idea, but it's not my decision to make, I'm not his guardian." Aberforth moved his gaze to him. "Not yet, no." The younger man frowned. "Albus wants to get guardianship over the boy." "Yes, I know, The potions master started to grow a bit irritated. Don't you think he will get it? Aberforth laughed softly. I don't doubt that what Albus wants, Albus gets. He will get guardianship over the boy, who would deny him that? My concern is whether he is up to it. Harry is still quite young and he is at a difficult age. Can Albus still keep up with him? Especially after what happened. And is it fair to Harry? Fair. Albus is old, my boy. Till now he has had iron health, but what about now? After everything that has happened. I hope he will be around for quite a few more years, but it is not as sure as it was a few months ago. Is it fair to Harry to get attached to such an old man? Severus pressed his lips together. The man had raised some valid points, none of which he wanted to think about. I think it's too late to do anything about that. Harry loves Albus with all his heart. Whether the old man takes guardianship over him or not won't change things. For what Albus has told me, the boy also loves you. The younger man snorted. So everyone says, and I love him quite a bit, but I don't see how one thing leads to the other. The boy loves quite a lot of people. Aberforth smiled softly. You could get guardianship over him. Severus shook his head forcefully. No, I love the boy and I like having him around, but this isn't about me. It is about what Harry needs, and Harry and Albus understand each other in a way I'm afraid I will never be able to. Not to mention that I'm not going to fight against Albus for guardianship. The old man remained silent, then he smiled. And if you were asked to apprentice the boy? Severus looked up sharply, clearly shocked at the notion. Me? Why me? There are many others that would do a much better job than me. I'm not good at teaching children, no matter how much I like them. It would be quite different teaching one-on-one than teaching a whole class. It would also mean you'd have joint guardianship with Albus over Harry, which would make his situation much more stable. The younger man sighed and rubbed his eyes tiredly. I don't know, it's difficult to imagine such a thing. Besides, I don't know why you're telling me all this. It will all come down to Albus and Harry. The old man started to move towards his brother's bed, a small smile dancing on his lips. I know, just think about it. Severus couldn't help but groan softly. He had the feeling that the man had just done what Salazar had done before, getting him ready for what was to come. Lan felt groggy when she woke up. Her limbs were heavy and it took her a while to open her eyes. When she finally managed to sit up in the comfortable bed, she saw that she was in the hospital wing instead than in the Ravenclaw Tower, and at once everything came rushing back. Quickly looking around, her gaze fell on Harry's sleeping form and she sighed in relief when she saw he was sleeping soundly with the potions master sleeping in a chair besides him. Her gaze moved further away, looking for Madame Pomfrey, but instead was met with a sight she didn't expect. Headmaster. The old man, who had been reading calmly in his bed, looked up when he heard the girl's voice. Ah, Miss Creevy, how are you feeling? The girl blinked and blushed lightly. I'm fine, sir. What about you? The man smiled gently. Much better, my girl, much better. Their short talk woke the potions master up, who immediately sat up straighter, wand already in hand. When he saw they weren't about to be attacked, he glared at the old man, who was looking back in amusement. Good morning, dear boy. The man's scowl deepened as he glanced towards his watch. It's 2 a.m, old man, you should be sleeping, not talking to your students. Without waiting for the older wizard's reply, Severus turned his attention to Lan. How are you feeling, Miss Creevy? The girl blinked, a bit startled by the question, but hurried to answer. I'm feeling fine, sir. How is Alec doing? He'll be fine. The professor looked towards the sleeping youth before returning his attention to the girl. I realize you may be feeling fine, but I can hardly send you on your way at this time of the night. Not to mention that Poppy would kill me if I sent off one of her patients, so I'm afraid you will need to spend the rest of the night in here and hope that our dearest nurse releases you in the morning. Melanie couldn't help but laugh softly at the sarcasm coming from the Slytherin heir. He was actually funny when he wasn't tearing you to pieces. Dumbledore, from his bed, shook his head in amusement. Now, my boy, no need for sarcasm. Why don't you go fetch Miss Creevy a mild sleeping potion? It will help her to go back to sleep. The girl went to argue, but the potions master was already on his way to the cupboard where the nurse kept all her potions. In a few seconds he had located the required potion and was beside the young witch again. "Here you go, drink it all down." Faced with taking the potion or arguing with the man, Melanie chose the least painful way and took the potion, falling asleep not even a minute later. When he was sure the Ravenclaw was sleeping, the young potions master turned to the headmaster, who was still sitting in his bed. "Let's get it over with, old man, what do you want from me this time?" Dumbledore laughed at the words his younger colleague had just uttered. "I see some things never change, Severus. What makes you think I need you to do something?" Snape rolled his eyes and took a seat next to the older wizard's bed. "You just ordered me to put a student to sleep. You're still sitting there despite the fact that you should be sleeping, and the fact that I know you well enough to know what to expect when you try to deny things in that tone of voice." Albus couldn't help but laugh again. "You're starting to know me too well, old friend." The younger man shrugged his shoulders even though he looked quite pleased with himself. "Come on, Albus, stop beating around the bush, I still want to get some sleep tonight." The older wizard nodded, a pensive frown shadowing his face. "I'm afraid you will have to wait with going to bed, Severus. As you pointed out, I would like to ask you for a favor." Knowing he was irritating the other man, Albus quickly continued. "The fact that Alicus Harry has come out, and by tomorrow morning we will have the castle full of reporters trying to get a look at the boy and Aurors trying to find out everything that has happened. I would like you to take him out of here before it becomes impossible to stay in the castle." A frown started to grow on the young man's face as the older man spoke. "Albus, I'm not saying that I won't do it, but do you think that that is a smart move? I agree that Harry needs time to rest. This last attack on top of everything else might have been too much, and yet, won't it be even more difficult to come back later? I know you want to protect him, but will you be able to?" The old headmaster remained silent for a short while. "I have thought about that too, Severus. You have to understand that I have ways to protect myself. I can tell the Aurors to piss off if I want to. I can force the reporters to get lost and only some of the staff might question me, but what is it going to be like for Harry? The student body is not going to leave him alone. They are going to hound him to find explanations about everything. His friends are questioning him right now. They won't be able to protect him until they have had a chance to reassure themselves that he is still the same boy. And you know him well enough to know that he won't come to us with his problems. Give things time to settle down. It's just 1 week till Christmas. Give Harry till after that to relax." Severus sighed, knowing damn well he wasn't going to win this argument, and privately he didn't really want to. Nodding, he first made sure Albus was settled comfortably in his bed before turning his gaze towards the sleeping boy. Not bothering to change his clothes, he gathered the young wizard in his arms, blankets and all, and silently left the room, aware of the blue, twinkling eyes following his movements. When Harry woke up, he was very surprised to find himself in his room in the headmaster's house. Aware of the throbbing in his shoulder, he carefully sat up in bed and swung his feet over the side, in search for his slippers. He had managed to get on his feet when Twinkle appeared in the room. "What is young master doing out of bed? He should be resting. Master Severus ordered it." Harry reluctantly allowed himself to be pushed back into the comfortable pillows and watched as the small house elf rearranged the blankets around him. When she finally stopped moving, he started to question her. "Why am I here, Twinkle? You said Uncle Severus was here. Where is he?" The house elf settled down next to him. "Master Snape brought you here last night. He said Master Dumbledore had ordered him to do so. He says you're going to stay here until you get better and that young master shouldn't leave his bed under any circumstances. Master Severus left just after lunch, said he needed to get some of your things from the school and report to Master Dumbledore. Master Severus should be back in an hour or so. He told Twinkle to keep you in bed and make young master eat something." The boy sighed and leaned back, closing his eyes as the small being disappeared, probably off to fetch him his lunch. Not that he wasn't grateful to be here, he assumed everyone knew that he was Harry now, but he felt he should have been there to try and explain things to his friends. His musings were cut short when Twinkle reappeared in the room, carrying a tray and ordered him to eat. Once he was finished, he felt sleepiness start to overcome him. He would have liked to stay awake until the potions master returned, but it seemed like he wasn't well enough yet for that. Snape entered the room half an hour later. Things had been hectic at the school. He had had to walk past dozens of Aurors who wanted to speak to either Harry or Albus. It seemed that they still didn't know that Harry was no longer in the castle, and as Madame Pomfrey kept everyone out of her infirmary, it didn't seem like they were going to find out anytime soon. After stopping for a moment in the Ravenclaw common room and gathering a few things for the boy, he went to the hospital wing. He ignored the Gryffindor students standing there and entered. Pomfrey was quite cross at him for taking Harry away and had no problems in telling him as much. Luckily, Dumbledore quickly drew her attention away to him. They talked for a while and then Severus quickly left again, not comfortable in leaving his young charge alone for a long time. The boy was sleeping when he arrived, but Twinkle assured him that he had awakened and eaten something. Settling down at the bedside, the potions master brought out the book he had taken from the library about apprentices. If Dumbledore was going to ask him to be the boy's master, then he would like to know just what he was getting into. Several hours later, when Severus was just starting to eat the dinner Twinkle had provided, Harry started to move slightly. Guessing he was about to wake up, the potions master put his plate aside and moved so he was sitting on the bed, next to the boy. Harry groaned as he was slowly brought back to consciousness. His shoulder was throbbing painfully and he couldn't help but wish he was still asleep. A gentle hand petting his hair finally managed to wake him up completely and he forced his eyes open. He wasn't very surprised to see his uncle sitting next to him. "Uncle Sev." Harry winced internally when he heard his voice was more a beep of pain than his usual infantile tone. The man gently caressed his cheek. "Are you in pain, child?" Alec barely nodded his head yes, and the man stood up at once, telling him he would go fetch a pain-reducing potion. When the teacher returned, Harry was lying once again with his eyes closed and the hand of his healthy arm was clutching the blankets tightly. Gently, the tall man propped the teenager up so he was leaning against his shoulder and put the vial against his lips. It didn't take long for the potion to take effect and Severus could see how the boy's face regained some color. "Better." Alec opened his eyes and nodded, with a small smile dancing on his pale lips. "Much better, thank you, Uncle Sev." The two stayed silent for a long while, before Harry decided to break the comfortable silence. "Uncle Sev." The man rolled his eyes slightly. "Will I ever manage to get you to call me Uncle Severus again?" That produced a laugh from the younger boy. "Don't think so, brat." Severus sighed and conceded defeat on that matter. "What is it you wanted?" Harry sat up a bit against high pillows. "Why am I here? Not that I mind, but aren't there classes? And what about Granddad? How is he doing? Is he still at St. Mungo's?" Severus raised a calming hand. "Calm down, child, one thing at a time." Harry bit his lip and nodded in agreement. "Sorry." The man shook his head and shifted so he was seated more comfortably on the bed. "Don't worry about your grandfather. He is at Hogwarts now." Minerva told him what had happened with Nerian and he decided he wanted to be there rather than at the hospital. "I still don't get how he convinced the healers, but he appeared there with Minerva and his brother." Harry's eyebrows shot up. "His brother is there?" Severus nodded slightly. "Indeed. Anyway, Poppy had a fit, but in the end she agreed to keep him there until he is well enough to be on his own. He asked me to get you out of Hogwarts. He wanted you to have time to recover. If you remember, it's only 1 week till Christmas, and you'll remain here until then. Hopefully, Albus will be joining us by then." Harry was smiling softly by the time Severus was finished. "We'll really spend Christmas here. I'm so looking forward to it." Then he started to frown a bit. "What about my friends? They must know by now who I really am." Severus pressed his lips together. "I'll talk to Minerva and we'll see if she allows them to come here one of these days. I realize you would like to talk to them for a while." Harry nodded gratefully and rested his head against the pillows, feeling a bit sleepy now that all of his concerns had been appeased. Severus, noticing, got up from the bed and moved to tuck him in. The boy blinked and frowned lightly. "Don't want to go back to sleep yet. I have been sleeping too much lately." Severus looked slightly amused at that. "Maybe you have, but you certainly need it. Besides, it doesn't look like you'll remain awake for very long. Your eyes are about to fall closed." Harry's eyes, which were indeed nearly closed, snapped open at once, eliciting a chuckle from the usually stern man. "Oh, Go to sleep, you silly boy. It's not like you have pressing matters to attend to and your body really needs the rest. The teenager pouted lightly but finally allowed himself to relax into the comforting darkness. Harry shifted nervously on the couch as he waited for Severus to return. The man had gone to Hogwarts to retrieve Ron and Hermione, after Minerva had granted permission for them to miss their morning lessons. The black-haired Gryffindor wasn't looking forward to the reunion with his friends, but knew that it needed to be done. At least, he wouldn't have to deal with Sirius and Remus until later on. The werewolf was still at St. Mungo's and Sirius had managed to stay with him until now. He didn't know if they had heard about him yet. Severus had avoided that question when he had asked, and for his part, Harry wasn't very eager to talk to them yet. After all, he knew how his godfather felt about Severus, and right now, if he had to choose between the two men, he was afraid he would choose the Slytherin head of house instead of his godfather. After all, the potions master had been there for him all this time in a way that Sirius hadn't had the chance to be. He had been so lost in thoughts that he jumped up from his chair when the fireplace roared to life and Severus entered the living room. The tall man looked down at him with an intent look, as if to see if he was feeling well enough for that particular meeting. Hearing the fire flare again, the potions master stepped aside and allowed Hermione to enter the living room. Harry stood up a bit shakily. That morning he had completely given up his disguise as Alec. His hair was back to his natural black color. Severus had changed his lenses so they were now transparent. He had come to prefer them to his glasses and had decided to keep wearing them. The makeup that had been covering his scar for months had also disappeared, leaving the mark plainly visible on his forehead. The only thing that showed he had been Alec was the phoenix pendant he wore around his neck, in which the charm to modify his voice had been dispelled, and the clothes he wore. For a minute, Hermione stood there, just staring at him with huge eyes. It looked like she hadn't really believed she was going to meet him. When the fact that he was really standing there finally entered her brain, she jumped and wrapped her arms tightly around his neck, burying her face in his shoulder. Harry bit his lip, unsure of how to react at such an action. He saw Ron enter the living room and stare at him the same way Hermione had just done. While the girl continued hugging him, the two boys stared at each other seriously, no hint of a smile on either of their faces. Harry knew Ron well enough to know he wouldn't have reacted well to the news. Especially if you took into account who he now considered to be something like a father figure. With a half-amused thought, he wondered what would piss the redhead off worse, the fact that he had been lying to him or the fact that he called Severus Snape, Uncle. Finally, after a few minutes of tense silence, Hermione drew back and Ron came closer. It seemed like none of them wanted to start the painful conversation. Harry was very aware that Snape had left as soon as Ron had entered the room and knew that he was on his own for now. The three of them were very relieved when Twinkle appeared with a soft pop and a tray of tea in her hands. Master Severus asked Twinkle to get tea for young Master. Harry gave her a grateful smile and helped the elf to put the things on the low table in front of the couches. Thank you, Twinkle. The elf nodded and disappeared with a soft pop. Turning towards his friends, Harry nodded to the couch. Why don't you sit down? I doubt you came all the way here to stare at me. Ron snorted, and without a word he plopped down on one of the couches with Hermione at his side and Harry opposite of them. They drank tea for a moment, before Harry decided to get this over with. I'm sure you have questions. That was what Hermione seemed to need, because at once she started to ask. Why this charade? Harry shrugged slightly. I thought that would be obvious. It was all for protection. I wasn't safe as Harry Potter and you weren't safe while I was around. Hermione sighed. So, you left the Dursley. Dumbledore found you and decided to do things this way. The other boy shook his head. No, Dumbledore went to check on me. I was ill and you know the Dursley would never take me to a doctor. Grandfather decided to take me away, and after that, he came up with everything else. Ron growled at him. He is not your grandfather. He is the headmaster. Harry looked at him intently. He has taken care of me, treated me as if I was a member of his own family. He loves me and I love him. We may not be related by blood but otherwise he is my grandfather, and unless he tells me he doesn't wish to be called that I will keep addressing him that way. Hermione quickly spoke before the redhead had the chance to reply. So the only ones to know about this were Dumbledore, McGonagall, and Snape. I can understand the first two, but why Professor Snape? Harry was shaking his head. No, Hermione, no one knew about this at first. Only Dumbledore, Twinkle, and I knew. We were aiming for maximum safety, and every time someone found out, the safety became lesser. Smirking a bit, he added, "Can you really believe Uncle Sev would have treated me the way he has if he had known I was Harry Potter?" The dark-haired Gryffindor saw how Ron clenched his fists. "How can you call that bastard, Uncle?" Harry raised an eyebrow. "Because he has been one to me this entire time. Because I got to know him without the prejudices and the hatred and managed to see the man he hides behind the mask." Hermione, sensing they were quickly heading towards an argument, interceded again. "Why don't you tell us how everything happened? It will probably make much more sense that way." Agreeing with her, Harry relaxed a bit against the couch and started to talk. He didn't want to spend hours talking, and there were things that were private, but in the end, he managed to get his point across. Ron, who had passed through several stages of anger and surprise, finally threw up his hands and shook his head. Only the headmaster could come up with such a ridiculous idea and make it work. Hermione and Harry laughed softly, agreeing with the others' assessment, but Ron wasn't finished. "Okay, I can understand about the need of being Alec, but what about Snape? He wasn't necessary for the plan to work." Harry shook his head. "No, he wasn't, but I've come to like him. He is interesting to be around with, he looks out for me." Ron was still shaking his head while the other boy spoke. "Are we talking about the same greasy git here?" The black-haired Gryffindor grimaced. "Please, don't call him that. You don't have to like him, but I do. Still don't see how you can forgive him everything he has been doing to you over the years." Hermione shook her head. "I think Harry grew up, Ron, and managed to get over petty grudges." The red-haired boy snorted. "You're talking about someone that has spent months pretending to be 11. Harry laughed. "Gave me more time to think about things." Jumping up from his seat without giving the redhead a chance to reply, he nodded towards the chess set he had gotten for his birthday. "Want to play, Ron?" The boy looked a bit surprised at the sudden change but readily agreed. He still couldn't understand most of what his friend had gone through, but he guessed he would never completely understand it. Maybe, he reasoned, that wasn't even necessary. Harry was there, safe, with a family who loved him and which he adored. For now, that was more than enough. Hermione seemed to be thinking along the same lines, because she sat down next to them and watched the game. Just as it had been a few months ago, when they had played in the train, the game was very evenly matched, but unlike that time, this time Harry actually won. Hermione and Ron were both quite surprised when the redhead was forced to admit defeat, but Harry was ecstatic. Jumping out of his chair, he started to whirl around the room laughing that he had won, which in turn made the other two laugh. Severus found them like this barely a minute later and frowned. "Harry," the tone of voice was stern but not overly harsh, "I thought we had agreed that you wouldn't get too excited about anything. You're still recuperating." The boy stopped at once and stared sheepishly at the man. "Sorry, Uncle Sev, but I beat Ron at chess." Severus had just enough time to catch the boy in his arms as he jumped into them. Ron and Hermione, who had become silent when the man entered the room, couldn't help but watch in amazement as the tall man hugged their friend close before putting him back on his feet. "I'm very glad to hear that, child. But now it's time for your friends to go back to Hogwarts and you to get back in bed. Poppy is going to come in a bit to check on you, and I won't hear the end of it if she finds you in this state." Harry pouted a bit, but one look into the man's face told him he was quite serious about that. Sighing, he turned to his friends and smiled slightly, accepting a hug from Hermione and a pat on his shoulder from Ron. They both quietly told him they would see him one of these days and headed towards the fireplace, where Severus was patiently waiting for them. Turning towards his charge, he nodded towards the door that led to the hall. "I'll take your friends back to Hogwarts. I want you in bed when I get back." Harry nodded slightly and the trio left. Knowing he hadn't been given much of a choice, the teenager turned around and went to his bed. Maybe he could convince Severus to play a game of chess with him, and maybe he would even be able to win. Christmas started out as a very cold day. It was snowing heavily outside and the wind was howling. Harry woke up slowly that morning and hearing the sounds coming from outside, he buried his face deeper into the blankets and closed his eyes, willing himself to fall asleep once more. Sadly for him, Severus didn't have the same idea. Barely a few minutes later, the man strode into the room and opened the curtains so that the slight, winter light filled the room. The teenager lying on the bed, buried his head deeper under the blankets, trying to ignore everything going on around him. Severus snorted when he looked towards the bed and all he saw were a few strands of black hair. He had half expected to be wakened up very early in the morning so that they could open presents, but it seemed that Harry didn't share that with his fellow teenagers. A small voice in his head told him that he might never have had any reason to do such a thing. Trying to ignore that fact, the man walked over to the bed and gently shook the teenager. "Come on, Harry, wake up." The boy barely moved, he only mumbled under his breath and the few strands of hair disappeared completely under the blankets. Chuckling, Severus sat down, realizing it might take some effort to get the young wizard out of bed. "Don't you want to open presents?" A muffled, "later," was all he got for his efforts. Resorting to something a bit harsher, he took the blankets into his hands and yanked them down a bit so that Harry's head was uncovered. He nearly laughed out loud when the boy turned around and hid his face into his pillow so that the light didn't disturb him. "Harry," the young wizard finally opened an eye and glared up to his uncle. Okay, I'm up, happy." Severus rolled his eyes and crossed his arms over his chest. "I'll have to see it to believe it. Come on, out of bed with you, lazy bones." Knowing he wouldn't be allowed to go back to sleep, Harry dragged himself out of bed and after picking up the clothes that Twinkle had put out for him, he locked himself in the bathroom. Returning to his room, he found Snape gone. Assuming that the man had gone to the living room, he left his quarters. He was expecting Snape to be on his own, so Harry was quite surprised when he heard him talking to someone. Entering the brightly decorated room, his breath caught when he saw the tall form seated in one of the comfortable armchairs. "Granddad." Both men looked up at the delighted cry, and Albus just had time to see the large smile that covered the youth's face before the small boy caught him in a dead grip. Chuckling slightly, the old headmaster gently patted Harry's back. "Hello there, my boy. How are you doing?" Drawing away slightly, Harry sank to his knees in front of the old wizard. "I'm fine. Uncle Sev has been taking good care of me." Looking mischievously to the potions master, he added, "Too good sometimes, he doesn't allow me to do anything." At once Severus slapped him lightly on his behind. "Careful, brat, or you'll be spending this evening in the potions lab working with the most disgusting ingredients." Knowing that the man didn't really mean it, Harry smiled lightly at him before returning his attention to the old man. "How about you, Granddad? I thought Madame Pomfrey wouldn't allow you to come here so soon." Dumbledore smiled softly at the thought of the overprotective nurse. "She wasn't very happy with me, but I promised I would return after lunch. And she made Severus swear he would keep an eye on me and that he would drag me back at the slightest sign of tiredness." Despite only having a few short hours with the man, Harry was ecstatic. He had wanted to visit the old man in the hospital wing before, but Severus had forbidden it quite forcefully. Not only because he was still recuperating, but also because it would attract unneeded attention. He had been able to talk to the old man through the fireplace twice, but it hadn't been the same. Now he had the whole morning to spend with Dumbledore and he wouldn't miss a single minute out of it. Twinkle appeared with a large tray filled with breakfast and the three of them started to eat, while Harry explained in detail what had happened in the last few days, which wasn't much but helped to keep his grandfather amused. Once they were done, Dumbledore motioned towards the tree. "I believe it is time to open presents. Why don't you go ahead, Harry?" The boy looked at the large mound of presents with narrowed eyes before sighing and sitting down next to them. "Let's see what store you emptied this time, Granddad." As it turned out, the presents were not only from Dumbledore. Chris and Amanda had also added a few along with Aberforth, making him feel welcomed into a family that he was starting to consider his own. The potions master had given him a box full of potion ingredients that they would use in their lessons along with a wizarding radio. From McGonagall he got a book on animagus, which he had yet to try out. Even his friends had sent him a few things, even though they must have rushed to get them on such short notice. An hour was spent admiring the different presents and joking about the things others had received. When the last present had been opened and the paper had been thrown away, Harry relaxed on the floor next to his grandfather. Happy, child. Harry opened his brilliant green eyes and beamed up to the man. It has been the best Christmas ever, Granddad, thank you. Dumbledore chuckled lightly and gently ruffled the boy's head. It was my pleasure, my child. Looking towards the tall man sitting quietly on the couch, looking through one of the books he had given him, Dumbledore decided it was time to have a serious discussion with the two. Harry. The boy looked up, a bit confused at the sudden serious tone. Is there something wrong? Severus, who had also looked up from his book, frowned. Are you feeling unwell, Albus? The old headmaster shook his head lightly and smiled reassuringly. No, I'm fine, but I think it's time that we talked about what's going to happen now that everyone knows. A feeling of dread started to fill Harry. Was he now going to lose the family he had just gained? Before he could start to sink into depression, a strong hand gripped his shoulder and forced him to look up at his grandfather's now stern face. Whatever it is you're thinking about, young man, if it has anything to do with breaking up this little family, you can forget it right now. Harry relaxed immediately. It didn't seem like the man was going to abandon him yet. Smiling slightly up to his grandfather, he nodded lightly. He was about to comment when he saw Severus stand up and start heading towards the door. Before he could say anything, his grandfather's voice sounded through the room. Severus, where are you going? The man turned around, a startled look on his face. I assumed you would like to talk privately. Dumbledore sighed impatiently. Both of his protégés could be so dense sometimes. Get back here and sit down. This discussion certainly concerns you as well. Rolling his eyes slightly, he obeyed the command and returned to his seat, half knowing what the man wanted to talk about. Returning his attention to the boy still sitting at his feet, Dumbledore started to speak. My time at Hogwarts has not only been spent by fending ministry wizards, reporters, and noisy people off. While they were all intent in trying to figure out everything you have been up to, I have managed to get guardianship papers over you, Harry. The only thing that is still needed is your signature, and after that, you'll be officially under my care, no matter what the ministry says. Harry couldn't repress a brilliant smile that grew on his face. To be Dumbledore's ward officially was a bit of a dream come true. Sure, he had been under his protection and care all this time, but it seemed silly how much a piece of paper could give him the security he had felt lacking till then. That's wonderful. Where do I need to sign? The old man chuckled softly and exchanged an amused glance with Severus, who was at the moment wearing a pleased smirk on his face. A bit of patience, my child. There is something I want to talk to you before we get to the paperwork. I have been thinking. Harry rolled his eyes and grumbled under his breath. Oh boy, that is always dangerous. Severus had to stifle a chuckle as the older man continued imperturbably. Next term you would have to return to 5th year, because it is quite ridiculous to have you in 1st year when everyone knows. Harry quickly nodded in agreement. On the other hand, it's a fact that you are already past 5th level. I'm sure you could take most of your owls easily right now. Harry frowned lightly. I don't think I could pass potions or herbology, nor history of magic and divination. Dumbledore smiled softly. I know, child, and don't worry, making you pass your owls now was not the idea. Anyway, in some subjects you're far ahead of your peers, and in the other ones, Severus could easily bring you up to level. The wizard in question immediately opened his mouth to protest. I absolutely refused to teach him divination. I didn't take it when I was a student, and I have no intention to start looking into it to teach someone, not even Harry. Dumbledore couldn't help but laugh at the forceful statement. Don't worry, Severus, I'm sure Harry can be convinced to take either ancient runes or arithmancy, maybe even both. Placated, the potions master nodded in agreement and settled back. Harry was looking a bit confused at the two of them. So, Uncle Sev is going to teach me after lessons. Will there be enough time for that? The old headmaster shook his head lightly. Not exactly, Harry. He drew out an old book from the folds of his robes. The apprenticing system was installed at Hogwarts at the time of the founders. Realization started to dawn on the boy's face as he was given the book. Salazar told me. Dumbledore looked pleased at this. Good, good, then you at least know the basic facts. There have been a few changes since Salazar's time, that's why I would like you to read that book and think about being apprenticed to Severus. I think that would be best for you, but I will allow you to choose since it will affect your future. Frowning lightly, Harry turned to the silent man. You would agree to be my master. Severus winced slightly at those words. Only if you agree to only call me that in class, a bit as you would use my professor title. I refuse to be called that by you if it's not necessary. Harry nodded. He didn't like having to call the man that either, so it would work out fine. Turning to Dumbledore, he nodded lightly. I will think about it, but if you permit the question, what does this have to do with getting guardianship over me? Albus gently ruffled the boy's head. Usually, when a master takes on an apprentice, he also gets joint guardianship over him so that he can act in case of something happening and the actual guardian or parent not being there. It also creates a deeper bond between master and apprentice that many think is very beneficial to the apprenticeship. The teenager nodded in understanding. That would certainly be one of the good things about this, but still, he wanted to think about the whole thing. Sensing that the boy wanted to think about everything, Dumbledore engaged Severus in a conversation over the school and Harry moved to a couch and opened the book he had just been given. He didn't have much time till term started and he had to make a decision. That evening, Severus was just bottling the potion he had started to brew after Dumbledore left when he heard a soft knock on his door. Having been expecting it, he cleaned the cauldron with a wave of his wand and opened the room. Harry was standing at the other side, as expected, a pensive frown on his face. Hello, Harry. The boy nodded in greeting. I have a few questions, Uncle, do you have time to talk now? The man smiled at the slightly anxious face. This is about the apprenticeship, right? When Harry nodded, the man closed the door after him and wrapping a long arm over the boy's shoulders, he steered him to the living room. Let's get comfortable and get some supper. The two of them made their way to the large room and settled down on the round table situated to the right of the fireplace. Twinkle immediately popped their dinner on the table and after asking if they needed anything else, she disappeared with a soft pop. For the first 10 minutes, both men concentrated on eating. By the time that dessert came around, Harry decided to broach the subject. So, you really would be willing to teach me? How would you be able to do that while teaching your classes? Severus placed his spoon down. You would be doing quite a bit of work on your own while I teach, either in the library or with me in the lab. The book said I could have more than one teacher if the master chose so, would that be the case? The potions master shrugged lightly. You would continue your lessons with Rowena and Salazar, and you could probably have a few lessons with Professor Sprout and Madame Pomfrey, but at least for the first year, you would be working mainly under my tutelage. Harry nodded lightly and moved over to another subject. Would I be allowed contact with my friends? From what I gathered from the book, apprentices usually lead a very lonely life. Severus looked at the boy intently. His expressive eyes were trained to him and he could easily pick up the fear of loneliness in them. Even though during that year he had been forced to keep away from his friends, he had still had people to spend time with, like the Creevy girl. Sighing, the man stood up and went to kneel next to the boy's stool. Harry, you have to realize that as an apprentice, your workload will be heavier than that of a normal student. You won't only be expected to keep up with your own work, but also to help me with my duties. Harry nodded. He had read that part. But, if you organize yourself well, you should have time to spend it with your friends. The only thing I will demand of you is that you finish everything first, okay? After that, your time will be your own, even if it might not be much, especially in the beginning. Will that be okay? The teenager nodded, reading in between the lines of what the man had said. He wouldn't be forbidden to see his friends, but he would probably not have much time for them. That made him feel sad and not so sure he wanted to go on with this. He knew he had power and that the apprenticeship to Severus would be the best way to learn to handle it properly. But on the other side he longed for a normal life, especially now that Voldemort was finally dead. The potions master stood back up and returned to his place. he could see the doubt in those green eyes. He wished he could have told him differently, but he wasn't about to lie to the boy now and have problems later on. Harry had been right when he said that an apprentice led a lonely life. He didn't have much time beyond that what he spent with his master. Was it right to ask him to make such a decision now, after he had had to spend so much time away from his friends? This would only make things worse, and if he hadn't lost their friendship yet, he was sure to lose it now. Not because of a fight or a misunderstanding, but rather because of lack of time spent together. Both finished their dessert quickly, and after that, Harry withdrew to his rooms to think. Severus debated for a moment whether it would be prudent to follow him, but after a moment decided against it, and instead he went to Hogwarts. He needed to talk to Albus about this. He was lucky. The old man had awakened shortly before and had just finished eating his dinner when he arrived. Madame Pomfrey looked a bit reluctant, but finally allowed him to talk to her patient. Albus listened intently as the potions master quickly told him the details of the conversation he had just had with the boy. After he fell silent, the headmaster leaned against his pillows and looked pensively. "What do you think, Albus? Is there anything we can do about it?" The older man frowned in thought, his eyes slowly starting to twinkle as an idea formed in his mind. With a sharp snap of his fingers, a house elf appeared in front of them. "What can Dobby do for you, Master Dumbledore?" The old man smiled kindly down to the exuberant house elf. "Ah, Dobby, could you please go ask Professors McGonagall, Flitwick, and Vector if they can join me up here? Also, ask Professor Sprout, but make sure to tell her to only come if she's feeling up to it." The house elf nodded eagerly and flapped his ears quickly. "Dobby will do so at once, Master Dumbledore." 10 minutes later, all the heads of house were gathered around the headmaster's bed, looking curiously at the man lying there. As was usual with the man, instead of going straight to the point, he started to talk about other things. "Ah, Pomona, it's good to have you back with us. How are you feeling, my dear?" The witch nodded slightly. Her face was still very pale, but the healers in St. Mungo's had assured them that she would be all right as long as she took things easy. "I'm fine, Albus, how about you?" The old man smiled brightly. "Fine, fine, I only wish I could escape Madame Pomfrey more often, but other than that I'm fine." The soft chuckles turned to laughter as they saw the nurse poke her head around the door of her office and glare towards her patient. "I heard every word, Albus Dumbledore, and just for that you're going to spend a week longer in that bed." Dumbledore shook his head in amusement as she disappeared again and turned his attention to Professor Vector. "How are things coming along?" The professor sighed softly. "It will take some time getting used to being the Gryffindor head of house next year, Albus. My workload was already tight and now with this it will be worse." The old wizard nodded in acknowledgement and his eyes turned serious. "That's actually what I wanted to talk to you all about. I have been thinking to reinstate the apprenticing system. It would only be for heads of houses since I don't want what happened 100 years ago repeating itself." At Pomona's look of confusion, he elaborated. The apprentice system was disabled then because quite a few teachers used their apprentices to do all the menial work they didn't wish to do and didn't really bother to teach them anything beyond normal lessons. "I know for a fact that none of you will abuse the students put in your care." Motioning to Severus, he continued with his explanation. "Severus has agreed to take Harry under his tutelage, but while talking about it with the boy, the fact that he is going to be spending a lot of time on his own came up. I would like it if some of you also took an apprentice. It wouldn't be an obligation, of course, but I think it would help you as well as the students under your care." Minerva was looking pensively. It sounded like a good idea. "How would this work, Albus? I thought that apprentices only learned under their masters. Even though there was more than one apprentice, they would still have to work on their own." The old man nodded in agreement. "That's true in a way, as I'm sure you wouldn't teach the same things as Severus. But while you are teaching your lessons, your apprentice would either be with you in the classroom or in the library. You could agree upon a few hours each day of mandatory library time in which all the apprentices would be there together, even though they weren't working on the same thing." Phileas nodded. "I guess that would work. Also, maybe we could design some kind of core lessons for all of them to take. I would like my apprentice to learn some advanced defense even though his main focus was charms, and maybe Severus could teach that to them all." Severus was nodding in agreement. That would work, and after the first year, maybe each apprentice could teach his own core subject. Nodding, Professor Vector took out a parchment and started to write down everything they were coming up. They would have to work hard on getting everything ready on such short notice, but she thought that it was a wonderful idea. It was close to 4 in the morning when Severus stepped through the fireplace into the Dumbledore Manor. He was nearly falling over with exhaustion, but he was pleased. What had until then been only loose ideas in their heads, an application of an old tradition, was now a well-defined plan that would be officially presented before the Board of Governors in 2 days. As soon as the board accepted, as he was sure they would, the other heads of houses were going to choose an apprentice. He was sure all of them already had someone in mind, so that shouldn't present too much of a problem, unless 2 of them choose the same student. The name of Hermione Granger came to mind at that, but he pushed it away. That wasn't going to be a problem for him. As he was removing the ashes from his robes, he was startled by a soft sigh. Turning around, he saw Harry curled up on a couch, soundly asleep. Shaking his head lightly, he walked up to the boy and took him into his arms. The movement jostled Harry awake. The boy peered up at the man that was carrying him in his arms with sleepy eyes. "Uncle Sev." The man started to walk towards the boy's room. "What were you doing there, Harry? I doubt that the couch is more comfortable than your own bed." The boy yawned and leaned against the man's shoulder. "Was waiting for you. Twinkle said you had gone to Hogwarts and wouldn't be long." Severus felt a bit guilty about that. He had completely forgotten to warn Harry that things would take longer than expected. "I'm sorry, child. We got caught up in our planning." Harry blinked, trying to keep his mind focused on the conversation. "Planning? What planning? Is everything okay?" A gentle hand went up to gently rub his back. "Everything is fine, child. I brought some of your concerns regarding the apprenticeship up to Albus to see if he had some idea of what to do. We have all decided that each head of house and the headmistress will have the privilege to have an apprentice. This way, you won't be the only one and you'll have companions to spend time with." Harry was smiling softly. "Thank you, Uncle Sev. That's actually what I wanted to talk to you about. I accept the apprenticeship." Severus hugged the nearly sleeping boy closer to him and chuckled softly. "Tell me again in the morning, when it doesn't sound like you're sleep talking." Harry laughed softly, but the steady rhythm of the man's footsteps completely lulled him to sleep. Familiar screaming woke him up the next morning. Frowning, he sat up in his bed, barely remembering how he got there in the first place, and rubbed his eyes, trying to listen to who was making all that racket. He could easily recognize the voices now that he was more awake. Groaning, he forced himself to get out of the warm bed and into the cold room. He needed to get down there before his godfather killed his uncle, but on the other hand, he really didn't want to get in the middle of those two. Knowing he didn't have much of a choice, he quickly got dressed in warm clothes and hurried down the stairs. He was shocked by the sight that met him downstairs. He had expected to find Severus and Sirius arguing with each other. He had heard that from his room. What he certainly hadn't been expecting was for his godfather to have his uncle slammed against a wall, ignoring the werewolf who was trying to get his arms away from the potions master's neck. Anger started to run through him at that sight of his uncle being pinned there, nearly defenseless, against the enraged man. Without even thinking about it, his magic surged, and sent an electric spark through the animagus arms, forcing him to drop Severus with a cry of pain. Before any of them could say a word, the youth's angry voice ran through the room. "What the hell do you think you're doing, Sirius?" The 2 adult Gryffindors turned around sharply, coming face to face with him, while Severus picked up his wand and stood up. Without even glancing his way, the man left the room, slamming the door after him and making Harry wince internally. Before he could decide between following the man and make sure he was all right, or stay and yell at his godfather, strong arms enveloped his tense form. "Harry, you're all right. I'm so glad to see you again." As much as he would have liked to give in into his godfather's hug at any other moment, he was too angry to even consider it right now. "Let go of me, Sirius." The man let him go, rather startled at the angry reception. "What's wrong?" Harry blinked in disbelief. "What's wrong? You're asking me what's wrong? I just woke up to your screaming, and when I come down here I see you with Professor Snape slammed against a wall trying to throttle him." That's what's wrong. Sirius shook his head, clearly not understanding what the big deal was. Harry, it was just Snape. The boy narrowed his eyes. And that's supposed to make it all right. The animagus opened his mouth to reply, but no answer came out. Instead, he started to frown. What did Snivellus do to you? The anger bubbling inside him was growing with each word that came out of the man's mouth, but he was still barely managing to contain himself. What makes you think that he did something to me? Because you're defending him. The teenager clenched his fists. So you're saying that just because I am mature and you are nothing else than a bully, he has to have done something to me? Before Sirius had a chance to defend himself, Harry started to scream. I am defending him because he has been helping me, because he has taken care of me, because I like him. I am defending him because you had absolutely no right to rush in here and attack him. I was trying to find you. Harry stepped closer, forcing the man to flinch back at the magic surging through the enraged boy. Well, you've found me, and not only have you found me, but you've managed to prove to me once again that you're nothing more than an immature bully that justifies his actions through his own bloody prejudices. By the time he said that, all the windows in the room were rattling under the assault of his magic. Remus, seeing that things were about to get out of control, firmly gripped Sirius' arm and dragged him to the fireplace. Without giving the man time to react, he tossed a bit of flow powder into the fireplace and called out for Hogwarts, sending his friend through the fire as soon as it turned green. Once the wizard had disappeared, the werewolf turned around to face the boy, who was still trembling in anger but whose magic was starting to calm. I'm sorry you had to witness that, Harry. The boy pursed his lips together. Don't apologize for him, Remus. I'm not, child. Are you going to be okay? Silently the boy nodded, causing the werewolf to sigh. I'm going back to Hogwarts. I have to make sure Sirius isn't stupid enough to return here right now. Send me an owl if you need help, Harry. Once again the teenager nodded and then watched as the werewolf left the room. Finally alone, he sagged against the wall and sat down on the floor, trying to let go of the anger still drowning him. He was snapped out of his dark thoughts when a small hand was placed on his knee. Is young master all right? The boy gave her a pained smile and sat up straighter. I've been better. Do you know if Uncle Sev is all right? The elf dropped her ears a bit. Master Severus locked himself in his lab and told Twinkle not to bother him, young master. Not having expected anything else, the teenager nodded and sighed. He would have to talk to the man, apologize for what his godfather had done to him, but right now he wasn't in the right frame of mind to do that. Standing up, he decided that the best he could do was to go back to his rooms. Twinkle frowned as she watched him move. Does young master want breakfast? Without turning, the teenager shook his head. No, thank you, Twinkle, I'm not hungry. Harry spent his whole day locked up in his room. Not an hour after the fight, an owl had arrived bearing a letter from his godfather, but he had just taken it and thrown it under a few books without opening. He really was in no mood to hear what his godfather had to say. At lunchtime, Twinkle came with food, but once again he dismissed her, not in the mood for eating either. For the rest of the evening, he buried himself in his books, trying to ignore the dread that filled him on how Severus was going to react. What had happened that morning was bound to bring back awful memories, all related to Harry's father. Knowing how his potions master could be, Harry was in no hurry to see him anytime soon. He probably would be blamed and all the time they had spent together would mean nothing. Twinkle appeared again at dinner time. He was about to dismiss her again when she spoke first. Master Severus told Twinkle to tell young master to join him for supper in the living room. Harry tensed lightly, but didn't move his gaze from his books. Please, tell Professor Snape that I'm not feeling well. If he had been looking at the elf, he might have seen the disapproving glance she sent his way before disappearing with a pop. 10 minutes later, his door opened without a knock and the man he had been trying to avoid entered the room. Turning around slightly, his eyes immediately fell on the man's throat and he could easily see the red marks that Sirius' hand had left there. Quickly turning back, his gaze became fixed once again on the page in front of him. Twinkle said you weren't feeling well. Much to Harry's surprise, the man's voice was fairly neutral, not the hateful drawl he had been expecting. Without turning, the boy nodded slightly. Repressing a sigh, Severus moved to his side silently and placed a cool hand on his forehead, startling the boy. You don't have a fever. Harry went to lower his gaze when the hand moved under his chin and he was forced to look into the man's eyes. Twinkle said you haven't eaten anything today. The boy sighed. I wasn't hungry. Severus shook his head and let go of the boy. Come with me. Harry frowned slightly. But, Harry, with me, now. Slamming his mouth shut, the boy quickly followed after the man, a bit intimidated by his stern demeanor. The man quickly led him to the living room where the table was already set for two. Severus motioned to a chair and after the boy was sitting, he took the other seat. The food didn't appear at once, so Harry was forced to look up at his uncle. The man was watching him intently through narrowed eyes, which made him feel uncomfortable. With his sternest voice, Snape started to speak. I don't know what you're thinking. Rather, I don't know for sure what you're thinking. But if it has anything to do with what happened this morning being in any way your fault, you are going to forget it right now. Harry blinked. Clearly he hadn't been expecting those words. Bowing his head slightly, he sighed. But it was my fault. If it hadn't been for me, Sirius wouldn't. Severus slammed his hand on the table, effectively cutting off what he had been about to say. You are not responsible for Black's actions. In fact, you are not responsible for the actions of anyone beyond your own. The thing with the mutt started long before you were even born, and today you were just an outlet for his loathing towards me. And that is, by no means, your fault. Harry bit his lip. He had been expecting an insulting speech or something like that, not this stern reprimand about how things weren't his fault. He didn't know how to react to that, but luckily Severus wasn't finished yet. If I remember correctly, you were rather adamant in your defense of me. Harry looked up startled. You heard. Snape smirked. I had to leave the room before I started to curse the mutt, but I certainly wasn't about to leave you alone with Black in the state he was in. Pursing his lips, he added. And though I can't say I disliked what you said to him, if you speak to any adult that way again you will be either grounded for a long time or spanked. You are still a child and you will show proper respect towards your elders or face the consequences, is that very clear? If for some reason an adult makes you angry or does something to you that you don't like, you will come to me or Albus or anyone you trust immediately, understood? Harry nodded, his eyes firmly kept at the table. Yes, Uncle Severus. Something else. The boy didn't move, causing Severus to sigh softly and wonder if he was being too stern. But he needed to have these things said and there was no better time as at the moment. Your magic sparked rather dangerously today, we will have to reinforce your control over it. Harry finally looked up at those words. We will. Severus raised an eyebrow. Unless you have changed your mind about the apprenticeship. Harry quickly shook his head. No, I haven't, but I thought you might have. The potions master groaned. Why would I have done that? There was no reason to change my mind. The youth bit his lip and nodded hesitantly. I think I know that now, but I thought so before. You don't have to think anything. There is nothing that would make me change my mind about this unless you tell me you don't wish to be my apprentice. So, is there anything else we need to talk about? The younger wizard looked hesitantly towards the man. Are you all right, uncle? At the man's confused look, he nodded lightly to the marks. That must hurt quite a bit. I'm sorry I wasn't down before. Severus groaned and buried his head in a hand. Harry, for the love of Merlin, nothing that happened today was your fault, so no apologies from you are required. I am fine, the marks will have faded by tomorrow, so there's nothing to worry about, okay? Harry nodded, finally relaxing against his seat. Okay. The potions master raised his head. I trust you're hungrier now. The teenager blushed slightly. A bit, yes. Good. I don't want you skipping meals. Your grandfather would have my head if he found out. Dinner progressed silently from then on, with Severus forcing his charge to eat quite a bit to make up from the meals he had missed that day. When they were finished, Harry was told that he was to go upstairs and go to bed. After all, the emotionally filled day and his magical outbursts had tired him out more than he thought. And indeed, when Severus went to check on him half an hour later, the boy was deeply asleep. Epilogue. Harry was sitting silently between Ron and Hermione at the Gryffindor table. Everyone had come back from Christmas break an hour before and the feast was about to commence. The students had been shocked and happy to see Dumbledore occupying his seat for what would be one of the last times. The black-haired Gryffindor knew how much of a fight his grandfather had had to put up with the nurse to get her to allow him to come this evening. Once everyone was finally settled, Professor McGonagall stood up and gently ticked her glass with her fork, calling for silence. Normally Dumbledore would have stood up to make an announcement, but this time the old man remained seated. Even so, his voice carried through the room effortless. Welcome back to another term at Hogwarts. I hope that these holidays were restful for you all. I have many things to explain to you this evening, so I hope you can give me a bit of your time before we eat to listen intently to what I need to say. As you were told last term, this will be my last year as headmaster of this school, and Minerva McGonagall was officially appointed as my successor a few days ago, so next year she will be the one leading things from where I sit now. The students muttered softly. They had all known that, and yet, when they had seen Dumbledore sitting there they had hoped. Smiling gently, the old man raised an old hand to ask for silence again. I think it is time for changes, big changes that won't only affect this school but also the whole magical community. Last term 2 of those changes were already implemented. Lord Voldemort was destroyed and a new minister was chosen, but that, as much as it will affect us later on, is not of our concern right now. What will affect you right now are the changes that are going to be implemented in the school through this year. As stated before, Minerva will take the role of headmistress, leaving behind the position of deputy headmistress and Gryffindor head of house. After speaking intensively to all faculty and to the board of governors, it had been agreed that Professor Vector will take on the role of Gryffindor head of house and that Professor Snape will, from now on, be the deputy headmaster. Harry's head snapped up in surprise. Why hadn't he been told about that? He quickly looked towards his uncle and saw him smirking his way, his dark eyes twinkling in amusement. The boy couldn't help for his face to fall into a small pout. They could have told him about that before. When the students finally became silent again, the headmaster was able to continue. Moving on, you will have noticed that the table belonging to the 5th house is now empty. The students who lived in the 5th house will now be able to return to their own houses with the understanding that if they step out of line again they will find themselves automatically suspended. The whole student body tensed at the man's words, knowing that that was not an idle threat. Of course, after the happenings of last term I hope that most prejudices have been erased and that a healthy rivalry will come from everything that happened. Dumbledore paused for a moment and took a long sip from his cup. I imagine that by now you're getting tired of listening to me, but I have one last matter to address. As some of you may guess, the duties of the heads of houses have been increasing lately. Those of you who have read Hogwarts, a history, will know that to help out the professors an apprenticeship system was installed at the time of the founders. Now, this practice was suspended about 100 years ago because of the abuse some apprentices suffered under their masters. Now, the heads of houses and myself have reviewed the rules in which the apprenticeship worked in the past, and with the Board of Governors' approval, I'm happy to say that this ancient practice will be reinstated. Once the apprentices are announced, they will have up to a week to refuse or accept. You need to make sure that this is what you really want. Because the apprenticeship will last for 5 years from the moment you begin. In your common rooms you will find a small book for each of you that will explain in detail what will be expected from you and what you can expect to receive from the apprenticeship. As said before, for now only the heads of houses and headmistress will have apprentices, but if the practice works, then the other professors will be able to join the program if they wish to. The students were whispering excitedly between themselves, no longer paying attention to Dumbledore. The old man, seeing he wouldn't regain their attention, just snapped his fingers and made the food appear. The heads of houses would explain everything that he had forgotten later on, in the privacy of the common rooms. Looking towards his grandson, he couldn't help but smile slightly. The boy was chatting happily with his 2 friends. He was glad that they were working on repairing their relationship. It was just what Harry needed. The boy seemed to sense his gaze on him, because he looked towards him and sent him a small wave with his hand. The old man returned it and finally turned his eyes to his meal. He had a feeling that everything would be all right. The end. I hope you enjoyed this story. Also remember to subscribe and like this video. See you in the next video.